Can we get folks to start to take their seats? We want to get started here. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time today. Today's hearing is focused on the 2017 hurricane season, specifically Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and some of the facts are really staggering. This is in 2017, there were 10 back-to-back hurricanes, and that hasn't occurred since 1893 in this country. So a season that was just jam-packed with hurricanes, again, something we haven't seen in over 100 years. It's the most expensive, estimates are that it's going to be the most expensive hurricane season on record, ranging anywhere from $200 billion to $290 billion. So again, this was a horrific year in regard to hurricanes, and our thoughts and prayers go out to all those who've been affected and continue to be impacted by the storms, as well as their fellow Americans working to restore the vital services in those communities. These storms, as I said, wreaked havoc upon large sections of the continental United States, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. They were nothing short of devastating, but thankfully, due to the efforts of the federal agencies before us today, Americans are recovering and rebuilding. As a committee with the primary jurisdiction over FEMA, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Environmental Protection Agency, it is our duty to hear from those federal entities directly about the disaster response and recovery. When a major disaster strikes, FEMA is responsible for coordinating the federal agency's response and ensuring the necessary federal capabilities are deployed. Oftentimes, the U.S. Coast Guard is one of the first agencies on the scene, conducting search and rescue missions, reopening ports, and responding to oil spills. Post-disaster, the Army Corps of Engineers expertise is drawn upon for emergency repairs, debris management, temporary re-roofing of housing, and critical infrastructure reestablishment. The EPA assists in the assessment of Superfund sites, oil sites, critical drinking water and wastewater facilities, and the coordination of storm debris management. This hearing is the first step in re-examining the authorities of those federal partners to ensure they have the tools necessary to help communities recover from disasters. Indeed, we owe it to those who have lost so much and endured so much suffering to identify and act upon lessons learned from this historic hurricane season. This committee has done so before in bipartisan fashion by its post-Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy. Our discussions here today will help us identify solutions that will help reduce future loss of life while lowering the cost of disasters and speed recovery. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Barletta, Hunter, and Graves for their leadership and for laying the groundwork on many of these issues. Our subcommittees have already done a lot of work focusing on how we can respond and rebuild smarter, and today we hope to hear from our witnesses what can be done to ensure each agency has the tools needed to do so. I want to thank Homeland Security Chairman Mike McCall for being here today to inform us about the needs of Texas and his community. I also want to thank and welcome Representative Gene Green of Texas, Representative Rutherford and Lawson of Florida, and our delegate from the Virgin Islands and the resident commissioner from Puerto Rico are not here yet, Ms. Jennifer Gonzalez Colon and Ms. Plaskett. They are both on their way, and we, again, look forward to hearing from them and getting their input on what's happened, how it's going, and there's no better way, I think, than hearing directly from our colleagues who represent those states and those constituencies. And look forward to hearing about what those communities and regions may need in their recovery. Also want to thank FEMA Administrator Brock Long, Vice Admiral Schultz of the Coast Guard, Major General Jackson of the Corps, and the EPA Regional Administrator Lopez. They are critical partners in this effort, and I look forward to their testimony and their ideas for improving on how the country can prepare to respond and work to prevent large-scale disasters. Again, thank all of you for being here. And with that, I recognize Ranking Member DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't repeat much of what you said, but in particular, I'm hoping that both our congressional witnesses and other members of the subsequent panel can talk about, where we are at today, a status report. We're distant from the places that have been impacted. I'm certain there is still tremendous displacement in southern Florida and Texas, and mostly these days in the news we're hearing about the ongoing problems in Puerto Rico. Where 20% of the people still don't have access to safe drinking water. Many of the plants are still offline for lack of power. 29% of Puerto Ricans have power, is the estimate. And, this is definitely not something that I would rate as a 10 plus, as the President has rated our response. And I want to find out what the issues are that are delaying actions in Puerto Rico, whether they're budgetary or logistical, in what form they take. Obviously, many of us were concerned when we saw the award of a $300 million no-bid contract to Whitefish Energy Holdings with 2 employees, who was going to be paying linemen $2,500 a day as subcontractors to restore power. I hear that's going to be canceled. I want to be assured by FEMA that there will be no federal reimbursement. I'm quite familiar with the federal reimbursement process, and we don't do no-bid dubious contracts at outrageous prices and give federal reimbursement to local entities who enter into such contracts. And then finally, I hope once and for all to put to rest the idea that somehow the Jones Act is inhibiting the recovery of Puerto Rico. We've had more than 20,000 containers delivered. The problem has been the logistics of getting those out of the port to the remote parts of the island. Want to hear more about the infrastructure problems that are inhibiting the distribution and what we can do about that in the short and the long term. I also hope to hear that we're going to be emphasizing in all of these communities resilience as we rebuild, and that whatever the federal government can do in terms of its reimbursement to encourage resilient rebuilding so that we won't be paying again and again and again for subsequent floods in Houston, or for things that just basically are destructed by wind in Florida and in Puerto Rico. Hopefully we can learn from this, and we can build in such a way that they will better serve their citizens in future events like this, which are becoming all too frequent. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeFazio. And just a point to make, Ranking Member DeFazio and myself will be this weekend traveling down to Florida, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands. I've been to Texas before with Chairman McCall to see the effects of the storms there, and also to Florida one other time. So again, I think it's important that we see it firsthand, but that's why it's so important for you folks to be here, because you're living in those communities, you're talking to those people every day. So I really appreciate you, the members that are here taking the time to talk to us today. And with that, I would recognize Chairman McCall for his statement.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, how about those Astros last night? Being from my home state of Texas, we're proud of that. But this hurricane unleashed fury on my home state and devastated many homes and communities in and around the district. After the storm, I toured much of the wreckage. Some of the images were absolutely horrifying. Roads were flooded, homes were destroyed, and sadly, many people lost their lives. I think this image says it all. It's kind of like the Iwo Jima of Harvey. You have a Department of Public Safety, a Marine, Coast Guard, and a Texas Guardsman, all in this vessel saving lives. My grandfather survived the 1900 Galveston hurricane. 10,000 people were killed. In this event, we saved 20,000 lives. So that's, I guess, if there's any good news out of this story, it was the lives that were saved and how the community came together. Our first responders answered countless calls, sprung to action, saving, again, 20,000 lives. Volunteers from churches, shelters, other civic groups became heroes during this grave time. And Texans from all walks of life came together to help their fellow Texans. One other, I think, image. This is Katy High School in my district. That became a forward operating base for the Texas Guard and active duty in service who rescued the lives in the greater Houston area and then sprung into action into Beaumont and other parts of my state. As the waters receded, the extent of our damage to our community became crystal clear. I remain grateful to Administrator Long and the men and women at FEMA for working with our governor, our first responders to coordinate the extensive federal response. The district I represent and the surrounding area has experienced 3 major floods in the last 2 years. More specifically, the flooding has become a major problem around the Cypress Creek and Addicks and Barker reservoirs. Chairman Schuster, I know you accompanied me down to Texas, and I appreciate you coming down to see firsthand the effects of this devastating hurricane. And as you can see from this map, I think this map really says it all about where we are with infrastructure in the United States and in my home state. In 1940, the Army Corps built the Barker and Addicks reservoirs. That's what you saw, the controlled spillage that then went into Buffalo Bayou and then into downtown Houston. But where the whole thing emanated was in Cypress Creek, that's outlined in red in my district. That levee, unfortunately, was never built by the Army Corps. Had it been built, we may have had a different situation that day. I am proposing the building of a reservoir. I think this is preventative infrastructure that can stop this kind of flooding in the future, and I think that's what this committee is all about, and I think committed to. These investments will minimize risks that we'd otherwise have to face down the road, ultimately saving taxpayer dollars. And that's why I'm working with FEMA, my governor, local officials, and colleagues to identify options for flood mitigation to protect the greater Houston area from future disasters. 2 ways I think Congress can help in these efforts will be to harmonize the approximately 40 types of mitigation and recovery assistance and work to address duplication of project issues so states like mine can utilize federal assistance most efficiently and effectively. As it stands, states would benefit from a congressional waiver of existing law that would allow federal entities the ability to provide funding to local governments for projects that are receiving other sources of federal funding in order to expedite critical disaster recovery projects. When communities are dealing with disaster recovery, the federal government should not be an obstacle to overcome, but a resource to help people put their lives back together. It's extremely important that we review the lessons learned from local, state, and federal coordination when it comes to response efforts in the wake of these disasters, but we must also discuss our most pressing infrastructure needs so we can minimize unnecessary damage or loss of life when the next disaster strikes. We cannot afford to wait. I cannot afford to wait 10 years to have the Army Corps of Engineers build this reservoir. Study upon study upon study. So Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, I look forward to working with you and the members of this committee to have a more expedited process that makes sense to help rebuild Texas, to make sure this never happens again. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, both you and Ranking Member DeFazio for allowing me to testify. I first have to say Congressman Edward G. Johnson and I started our political careers in 1973 as young state legislators in the Texas legislature. So Eddie B. and I, she's watched when I was newly married and with my children, and now she sees my grandchildren growing up. So the 29th district that I represent includes northeast and southeast Houston, Harris County, a very urban area and one of the most highly impacted districts by Hurricane Harvey. We have 10 members of Congress who represent the upper Texas coast, from Corpus Christi up to the Sabine border with Louisiana. One of the biggest issues in our district in Houston and Harris County is the delay in Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, handling of disaster assistance. 2 months after Harvey's landfall, there's still a significant backlog of disaster survivors waiting for inspectors to verify the damage to their homes and property. Recent reports indicate that the average wait for a home inspection is over 1 month, far exceeding the wait time for inspections following Tropical Storm Allison and Hurricane Ike that also hit our areas. Constituents have registered frustrations regarding the FEMA telephone helpline. In the weeks following the flood, impacted individuals sometimes spent hours on hold before reaching a representative, and many experienced repeated disconnections. While we appreciate FEMA's prompt response to our office, when we make inquiries on behalf of our constituents, individuals should not have to contact their member of Congress to obtain FEMA assistance, but we ask them to. It's our office experience that FEMA's individual assistance program is not administered uniformly. We've seen neighboring properties in our community with similar damage receiving vastly different amounts of federal aid, subject to inspectors with varying levels of experience and knowledge. We ask that the Transportation Infrastructure Committee ensure that FEMA's individual assistance program is administered fairly and uniformly. Our most concerning constituent requests are a growing number of senior citizens and low-income families who lived in special flood areas and could not afford flood insurance. Many of these seniors and low-income households who are the greatest need for aid are prohibited from receiving assistance because they could not afford flood insurance premiums. In some parts of Houston, Harris County, flood insurance premiums are in excess of $4,000 annually for a modest home. Our office is currently working on legislation to create an exemption for seniors and low-income households who could not afford flood insurance to be eligible for federal disaster assistance. And I also asked the T&I committee to consider ways to provide immediately help for low-income disaster survivors to receive federal aid they desperately need. The current prohibition treats our families simply as numbers and not as law-abiding, hardworking Americans that they are, and who may completely be wiped out if their government refuses to help them. At the same time, many communities face these same barriers when coming to preventing the next flooding disaster. All $8.7 billion has been requested for flood prevention projects for our bios. When it comes to approval for these projects, Harris County Flood Control District, partnering with the Army Corps, is required to do a feasibility study that takes into account the cost of the project against the value of the homes protected. I live in a blue-collar district where home values are not as high as they are on the East Coast or even in other parts of Houston, Harris County. Oftentimes, Harris County Flood Control has trouble getting projects green light for our district because the price level of homes are being protected. These homes are not wealthy homes, so they say the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work. But these folks get flooded in the last 3 times in the last few years. This puts families in an incredibly tough place because your house faces the potential to flood every major storm. You basically struck in a high-risk area. It's tough to sell the house, and flood insurance simply is not their means to afford it. Harris County Flood Control, along with the governor, has also requested $800 million for a buyout program that had been successful in Houston. This allows the city and the county to buy many of the more flood-prone properties, which greatly reduces the future financial burden on the system. Most people are willing to be bought out immediately after a bad flood. It's imperative we get this money as quickly as possible so local entities can move quickly while there is demand. This is one situation we simply can't afford to wait. I also represent part of the Port of Houston in our district, and I share it with Congressman Brian Babin, who's on the committee. The silt from the bayous has drastically limited maneuverability and depth. The port has recently completed dredging to 45 foot, allowing for much larger ships to come in from the Panama Canal. Many of the ships can no longer get through the channel due to the hurricane damage. The port currently estimates that the first phase of recovery from the storm could cost an estimated $457 million. The ship channel is the lifeblood of Houston. Most of the industry in the city is in the same way connected to the port. It's absolutely essential in our district that we adequately fund core projects that get the port back at its normal capacity. And on the national significance, we have 5 refineries in East Harris County, and you saw that after what happened with Hurricane Harvey, the refineries were shut down. They don't turn them off and on with a switch. It takes time to get them up. And we were paying 25 to 30 cents more per gallon in our fuel because of the refineries that were shut down because of Hurricane Harvey. I want to thank the T&I committee for the opportunity to speak this morning, and I'll be happy to answer questions in the committee have any. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Appreciate you being here again, and now recognizes the Representative Rutherford for statement.
DeFazio.
And can you pull that mic? Can you pull that mic a little closer to you?
Is that better?
I think, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And as you know, last month, Hurricane Irma touched almost every corner of Florida. In my district in Northeast Florida, a combination of a nor'eastern, high tides, and the torrential rains caused by Hurricane Irma caused flooding in the city of Jacksonville not seen in 150 years. Downtown was literally underwater. Power was out for many days. Homes and businesses were shuttered. However, because of the quick federal response, the leadership of our governor, and the planning and coordination of local emergency management officials and first responders, as in Texas, lives were truly saved and our community was back up and running. Florida now faces a long road to full recovery, but for the purpose of this hearing today, I'd like to focus on 2 areas of hurricane response and recovery that are under the jurisdiction of this committee. One is the importance of shore protection projects, and the second is the importance of maintaining the Jones Act. And I think Ranking Member DeFazio spoke a little bit about that, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. But first on shore protection, you can see on the screens here, for coastal communities like mine, beaches and sand dunes and other shoreline infrastructure provide the first line of defense against that storm surge. New Jersey saw it 5 years ago with Superstorm Sandy, and Florida saw it last year with Hurricanes Hermine and Matthew, and then again this September with Hurricane Irma. A great example of what happens when the shorelines are not protected properly can be seen on the screens here in the room. That home that you see in the sand is in a region of my district that was hit by Hurricane Matthew last October, but where the beach had not yet been rebuilt and renourished. And now after Irma, that home is gone, and it may be difficult to see here, but the 10 homes going south from that location are really on a precipice. They are right about to fall in, as this home already has. Shore protection is very personal to coastal districts like mine. However, I want to emphasize that shore protection projects should be important to more than just coastal communities. 50% of the U.S. population lives within 1 hour of a seashore, Beaches help generate $225 billion for the national economy and contribute $25 billion in federal tax revenue. They also contribute to a $26 billion trade surplus in tourism in my state. Not to mention that when local, state, and federal agencies invest in shore protection projects before a storm, less funding is needed for rebuilding roads, utilities, businesses, and homes after a storm hits. When we look back at Hurricane Matthew last October, studies show that beach renourishment had saved billions of dollars in infrastructure damages. And that is a matter of safety, but it's also a matter of fiscal common sense. And Mr. Chairman, I want to commend your work over the last few years, moving water resource bills on time and with strong bipartisan support. It was great to see that the WARDA 2018 process last week in my home state. Water resource projects like the pending beach renourishment project in my district that would rebuild Northeast Florida's beaches hit by Hurricane Matthew and now Irma, these projects cannot move forward without the important work done in this committee. Now, second, I'd like to highlight the importance of the Jones Act, not only to my district, but also to the recovery of Puerto Rico. And I think Ranking Member DeFazio was absolutely correct. The Jones Act has not added difficulties to the recovery in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The goods getting to the port were not the problem. It was the distribution from the port into the country where the need was at. That was the difficulty. The U.S. Maritime industry are first responders in times of emergency like Hurricane Irma and Maria, and Jacksonville is ground zero for getting shipments of much-needed goods to Puerto Rico quickly, reliably, and economically. And I'm proud of the work that the American maritime industry has done these last few weeks. They have been working tirelessly around the clock to get shipments of goods to those in need. Jones Act carriers to date have delivered tens of thousands of containers to the island via the Port of San Juan. They've worked closely with federal emergency responders, customers, and nonprofit organizations to meet the ever-changing and increasing needs of the island. They have proven themselves committed to meeting Puerto Rico's immediate needs while also supporting the long-term restoration of the island's economy. And part of the rebuilding effort is also making sure that the hundreds of maritime employees, both in San Juan and in Jacksonville, are able to keep their jobs. The Jones Act provides stability to these American workers and certainty to industry, which in turn has reinvested more than $1 billion into vessels and infrastructure in the shipping corridor between Jacksonville and San Juan. As an example, over the last 5 years, Tote Marine has invested more than $500 million in Puerto Rico trade. This includes the world's first 2 liquefied natural gas-powered container ships, and these ships have the fastest transit time in the trade, traveling from Jacksonville to San Juan in 2.5 days. Consistent application of the Jones Act enables Tote to make these 35-year investments that ensure consistent, on-time deliveries to the people of Puerto Rico, and that ensure cargo shipments back to the mainland to support the island's manufacturing sector. And it's this continuity and certainty that position the U.S. maritime industry in Jacksonville to be so capable to respond to the needs of Puerto Rico as the Coast Guard reopened the port after Maria. Again, I want to thank the committee for having this panel today. Hurricanes know no political party. We all must work together so that our communities can recover and rebuild stronger than ever. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Appreciate you being here today. Appreciate your outlook. With that, I recognize Representative Lawson for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member DeFazio, and distinguished members of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the impact of Hurricane Irma had on our congressional district in Jacksonville. I also wish to thank Congresswoman Frederica Wilson and Congresswoman Franco for the opportunity to appear before this committee. On September 11th, which is incredible, this year, Hurricane Irma hit Jacksonville with incredible force, causing record storm surge and massive flooding in several neighborhoods around the city, and power outages for over 260,000 homes, leaving thousands of citizens displaced. According to the National Weather Service, water levels for St. John River hit a record high of 5.57 feet downtown Jacksonville, and similar dangerous levels in neighborhoods along the river. These are historic levels of flooding, which we haven't seen, as you heard with Congressman Rutherford, in centuries. Except for the National Weather Service also reported that the vast amount of water in the St. John River will continue to threaten communities in northeast Florida during large storms, making the areas that are more vulnerable every year. Jacksonville utility officials estimate that Hurricane Irma produced over 200 billion gallons of rainwater to Jacksonville in the areas in a matter of days. This water is equivalent to 22 days of water flow through the St. John River. Hurricane Irma also negatively impacted Jacksonville economy. Flooding caused extensive damage to Wells Fargo Center of 37 stories office building in downtown Jacksonville, closing the building for 25 days, causing significant damage to main electrical and air conditioning elevators and telecommunication system. The Hyatt Regency Jacksonville Conference Center Riverfront Hotel, where you have 950 rooms, encouraged severe flooding and closing the hotel for 7 weeks. Similar businesses also have struggled to get back on track. Power loss to more than a dozen pump stations, causing more than 1.5 million gallons of untreated raw sewage to overflow into the river and into the city streets. Nearly 200,000 gallons of raw sewage spilled into the streets of Ribault Scenic Community, of which we had the opportunity to observe total damage. The storm high water and strong winds have left 29 city parks and other facilities without limited access closed. Most of the closure are waterfront parks, piers, boardwalks, floating docks, and boat ramps. The damage caused by Irma only adds to the damage caused by October Hurricane Matthews, which are still waiting, as a city, waiting for millions of dollars, some like $26 million in reimbursement, and had left many residents frustrated about the lack of speed and funding following these areas. During the storm, we are glad that our local transportation authority, Jacksonville JTA, played a critical role in helping transport people to safe locations. The JTA evacuated over 800 citizens and more than 120 people with spread the needs that need special needs in shelter. The JTA, as an integral in assisting Jacksonville electric, water, and sewer utilities by transporting 2,700 mutual aid and other utility workers between hotel and staging areas. What is important on behalf of Jacksonville for local mitigation strategy, I am specifically requesting that 11 flood and storm surge projects costing an estimated of $79 million. In addition, I am requesting funding for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers flood study of about $20 million for flood resilience effort in Jacksonville. Additionally, I'm introducing legislation to appropriate funds for flood control and storm damage reduction projects to be constructed by the United States Army Corps of Engineers in Jacksonville. This will greatly benefit areas in our community that was deeply impacted by flooding areas of Hurricane Irma, and also offer protection for future storms, which the chairman mentioned earlier, by providing quality flood control infrastructure. I want to thank this committee, and when I look up there and see Congressman Dan Webster, many years, the effort that when you were Speaker of the House has really helped out a great deal in Florida, because we have seen a significant of hurricanes and money that Congressman Rutherford was talking about for beach nourishment. We had a hard time at one time selling Florida legislature how important it was to bring resources back to the state of Florida and to help tourism and to recover. So the money that was well spent back then during your era has really stimulated the economy in Florida, and I thought it was worth mentioning. I look forward to working together to ensure our citizens are safe and healthy following these events, and to act policies that would lessen the burden during the next devastation of storms. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate your time today. Thank you. And with that, recognize Commissioner Gonzalez-Colon for her statement.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member DeFazio, and all members of this committee for having me here today. This is a great opportunity. As you may know, I am the single...
Can you pull that whole box closer? You got to pull the whole box closer to you. I don't know why that comes
That's
from
better. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you may know, I'm representing 3.4 million American citizens living in the island. So I have a voice, but I don't have a vote. That's the reason this hearing is so important for Puerto Rico. And in that matter, the help that Puerto Rico received from Congress and the administration after the disaster has made a huge difference, but there's still much left to do in both short-term remediation as well as long-term rebuilding. From roads to air, seaports, and communication, all aspects of our infrastructure suffered. At the peak of the storm, the whole power grid went offline and communications failed. We still have 70% of our island without power, 20% without running water, and 20% without access to networks. In Puerto Rico, we have lived the scenario of a shutdown of almost all the technological resources and a real catastrophe. That's the reason we are living in a humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. It caused total paralyzation of the economy, workers and business still unable to produce, and this is already impacting the nation. Puerto Rico plants produce 10% of the U.S. pharmaceuticals and medical devices, a $15 billion market, and shortage loom already. Manufacturing represents 42% of our economy, 30% of it in pharmaceutical, medical devices, electronics, among others. One of the main issues in the numbers of roads and bridges that cut off limited response access and communities completely. That's the reason we need to look beyond immediate response for bridges, power grid, and blue tarps under the Corps of Engineers. We also need measures that enable rebuilding infrastructure, waiving the cost share requirement for all highway administration and FEMA disaster recovery funding, including permanent construction. Today, the situation in Puerto Rico is still challenging. 66 of 68 hospitals are open, but 19 of them still on generation power. 64,000 temporary roof tarps have been received. 18,000 blue roof installation has been approved, but just 4,000 are being installed. We are really shy in that number. 70 shelters continue open with more than 3,000 people on it, and most of the island still not able to receive regular commodities. That's the reason it has been mentioned that much of the damage we are facing in Puerto Rico is a result of an inferior level of infrastructure, construction, and maintenance. While this could be true in some cases, it must be noted that such is a necessary result of budgetary and funding limitations imposed upon the territories. Differential treatment in programs of funding, outright exclusion in some cases, be it by law or regulation, results in territories forced to do their best they can with extremely limited resources available because their political status limits their access to federal grants and credit backing or benefited from administrative or legislative measures to provide a more resilient infrastructure. This also goes to the disparity in funding from healthcare, and we can go on and on. The obstacles in the response process itself keep remind us of Puerto Rico's separate but an unequal condition. Immediate recovery steps that need to be taken include flexible application of NEPA and other regulations to balance the need of environmental protection with the major problem of the cleanup and the debris removal. Flexible application of requirements of housing subsidies, such as Section 8 housing assistance, to take into account that the majority of the housing in Puerto Rico is safe, but simply there's no electric grid running. Administration approval of access to public assistance categories C, G, under FEMA for major disaster declaration. These are the categories that address actual repairs to infrastructure, roads, bridges, water control facility, building equipment, utilities, park, recreational, and so forth. A comprehensive recovery requires that these be included as the extent of damages in Puerto Rico requires permanent rebuilding, not repair, of our infrastructure. Additional congressional measures will be necessary to enable the reconstruction of our infrastructure to begin. Action of Congress will be necessary to waive the cost of share requirement of the Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief Program for FEMA funds, including permanent repair in both cases. In the case of Puerto Rico, it requires 20% local match in permanent repair projects, and the government of Puerto Rico, as you already may know, lack of funds at this time. Another important step will be enable Puerto Rico to access funds from the Infra Grant and Tiger Grant programs for the permanent rebuilding process. Those programs also need at least 25% of funding and require matching funds. Moving forward, the legislation in favor of small business growth, H.R. 2429, 2488, will help stem the drop of small business activity. Congress should consider creating programs in which dollars assigned to cover unemployment may be used to cover wage incentive for job creation so that the businesses can have their employees return to work. There are many other areas that we can continue to emphasize in terms of what are the urgent needs for Puerto Rico and the territories, and I hope this committee may find it in the written statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Appreciate you being here, and I just wanted to tell you again, I don't think you or Ms. Plaskett weren't here when I said Ranking Member DeFazio, myself, and Congressman Garrett Graves are going down to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands Sunday and Monday with a contingent from the United States Senate. So again, I appreciate you. To see you. Somebody hacking in on me? I got a bit of a cold, but I don't think I'm wheezing that much.
Well, she sings a lot better than you do, Chairman. I'm just saying.
Well, again, Commissioner, thank you very much for being here. And with that, I recognize Delegate Plaskett for her statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the important matters of disaster response and recovery in transportation and infrastructure. I would also like to direct your attention to the screen where we have some photos of the actual devastation in the Virgin Islands. That's the hospital that you're seeing right there. I want to echo the sentiments of my colleague Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon in that much of the issues that we are facing have much to do with the disparity in funding that the territories have received before the hurricane occurred. On September 6th, Hurricane Irma wreaked havoc on the islands of St. John and St. Thomas, and 2 weeks later, on September 20th, the island of St. Croix was devastated by Maria, both Category 5 hurricanes hitting the U.S. Virgin Islands. The people of the Virgin Islands have lost their homes, possessions, businesses have lost, along with hospitals, schools, utility systems, and vital infrastructure. The President and leaders in Congress have committed to Americans in the territories that they will receive the support they need. The islands were completely cut off from the world until air and sea support could at least resume basic operations to the islands. I will remain hopeful yet vigilant in my work to see that Congress delivers on the promises to support the Virgin Islands and the territories. Disaster legislation passed thus far has provided some necessary support. I'm pleased to see $5 billion included in the latest package to provide the territories with additional liquidity assistance and the flexibility with local match requirements. There is no substantial revenue being generated in the Virgin Islands right now. With the loss of Hovensa oil refinery and the changes in the Jobs Act of 2004, our tourism-related economy is now estimated at 50% of our GDP is gone. We will miss this year's season at least. For example, Keneal Bay, the largest employer on St. John and one of top resorts in the island, has estimated it will take at least 2 years for them to rebuild. Much more will be needed. In terms of FEMA programs, we will need cost-sharing waivers for permanent assistance under categories 6 through G, especially categories in roads, bridges, and utilities, and 100% federal share of hazard mitigation. We will also need temporary waiver of the local match for other needs assistance. We need a suspension of the cap on disaster housing assistance, one to at least double it. Currently, the maximum amount of disaster housing assistance is inadequate in the high-cost, highly damaged areas like the Virgin Islands. The islands are also in need of other important recovery funding left out of the most recent disaster bill. For example, it did not include economic development programs, additional support for repair of our water infrastructure, seaports, airports, and roadways, all of which had been included in previous disaster relief legislation. With an economy that primarily relies on tourism, the Virgin Islands depends heavily on infrastructure. Given the catastrophic level of damage suffered, the recovery of our islands will hinge on the level of support from Congress for infrastructure rebuilding. Our 2 hospitals devastated, Army Corps has condemned them both. 8 schools have been destroyed. Furthermore, we will need in regulatory relief of our rebuilding. I urge that this committee consider options for prioritizing disaster-affected areas and permitting done by Army Corps, NOAA, and other agencies so that we may no longer face permitting backlog that has delayed important projects. Our needs are great, and it's partly a result of issues that have been longstanding. Our hospitals have been chronically underfunded for decades. Our Medicaid is a block granted at an amount that has no relationship to local needs. Match limited to an arbitrarily low 50% by Congress, that of the wealthiest state. Our school facilities were woefully deficient. Congress has not been willing to grant the Department of Interior requested funding to support maintenance levels for any of our schools. The 2004 Jobs Act overreached in residency, which removed much of the knowledge-based businesses that brought people like myself back home before 2004. So Congress shares some responsibility for the level of devastation due to chronic neglect, a benign neglect of the territories. That includes this committee as well. T&I, the territories used to be treated as state under National Highway System programs with a percentage of funds, but this was changed to move us into a separate allotment and an amount significantly lower than what we had previously received. Federal transportation funding to the islands fell behind other jurisdictions, even though the traffic strains of our infrastructure were greater than our population due to the high number of visitors. Territorial roads continue to be under stress from inadequate funding, and the Virgin Islands, most of the federal highways do not meet current standards. Again, this was before 2 Category 5 storms. Because the territories are islands, much of the road construction is more expensive than on the mainland to accommodate supply costs. As a result of inadequate funds, crucial projects have been shelved, leaving only stopgap repairs to resolve maintenance issues. After Irma, and especially after Maria, much of our roads and ports, old and lacking upgrades, were destroyed. As the week continued, major roads are impassable. Places like Windberg, downtown Frederiksted, massive flooding, impassable roads. Charlotte Amalie became a flood zone. The sea took it back over. I would like to emphasize that this negatively impacts everything from commerce, emergency response capabilities, to disaster relief. Extreme weather during this hurricane season further demonstrates how fragile our infrastructure already was and how much we depend on it. We must keep this in mind as we move forward and consider changes to help the U.S. territories. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on your behalf on this.
Well, again, I thank each and every one of you for being here. Appreciate you taking the time today. And again, as we move down the road on this, we'll certainly be checking in with you, talking to you. And again, this, as I said, Sunday, Ranking Member DeFazio and myself will be in the territories to take a look. So again, thank you all very much. Appreciate you being here. And with that, we'll take a couple of minutes. Our next panel will make its way here. So everybody sort of be patient. Be a couple minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, can we all get back to our seats? We want to get started here. The committee will come back to order. At this point, I'd like to thank and welcome our next panel. Really appreciate you four taking the time to come up here. I know how busy you've been. I know how busy you'll continue to be. There's a lot of work left to do. And so I can't thank you enough for being here, taking the time to do this, but I think it's important that we hear directly from you. We just had a panel of members of Congress representing those various areas that have been hit, Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And so it's important for us to hear from you, the folks that are actually on the ground doing the work, responding. And so, again, I want to thank you for you taking your valuable time to be here with us today. Our next panel is four participants. The Honorable William Brock Long, Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Vice Admiral Carl Schultz, Commander of the Atlantic Area, United States Coast Guard, Major General Donald E. Jackson, Jr., Deputy Commander, General for Civil Emergency Operations, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Honorable Pete Lopez, the Regional Administrator for Region 2 of the EPA. Again, thank each and every one of you for being here today. And with that, I would without objection, first of all, I want our witnesses to have their full statements in the record. We ask you to keep it at about 5 minutes. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions afterwards. So again, your full statements will be part of the record. And with that, I recognize Administrator Long. Would you proceed?
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Brock Long, obviously, a FEMA administrator, and I'm here to testify about the critical role that FEMA has played in numerous disasters over the past several months, unprecedented number of disasters. I've been in office a total of 134 days. For 72 of those days, we've been working around the clock. My dedicated staff has been working around the clock to try to alleviate the pain and suffering that's taken place as a result of 4 catastrophic events that have occurred: Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the devastating California wildfires. We continue to work. In addition to those 4 major events, my agency is also responding to 25 other disasters across 19 different jurisdictions that many of you represent as well. This has been the longest activation in FEMA history, and I'm extremely proud to continue working with my staff and the members of the National Response Plan framework that have been going around the clock. While many improvements have been made to ensure a whole community response, I recognize that there are many challenges, and we got a long way to go to truly building a resilient nation. And I'll be asking for your help to help me do so while I'm here in office. I think we have to look at this as, while there's a lot of work, this is an opportunity to hit the reset button and truly formulate authorities and the way forward to help us mitigate future disasters. I also think I'm going to use this as an opportunity to acknowledge what FEMA's role is as granted by Congress through the Stafford Act. An optimal response is designed to be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed, not the other way around. It's my job to coordinate the full firepower of the federal government down through governors to support their response and recovery efforts, not mine. I don't know how to put back your communities better than you do. Each level of government has a critical role to play and has to be well defined. In Puerto Rico, the local and territorial governments, as you know, were struck by rapid succession, 2 major hurricanes that basically overwhelmed not only the staff but the physical capabilities of the island, thrusting us to be the primary responder and basically the sole responder for many weeks after the fact. That's not a complaint, that's just the facts. I know that we're working very hard with Puerto Rico as well as the Virgin Islands, but we're also working hard, as I said, with 20-some other jurisdictions around the clock. FEMA is never designed to be the first responder, nor should we be, and I would like to be able to discuss and have open dialogue with you today on how we can better the entire disaster response community going forward. I want to put some magnitude around what's just happened. It's estimated that from Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the California wildfires that 25 million citizens, or 12% of the population, has been impacted by one of those 4 events. FEMA search and rescue teams alone are credited with saving 9,000 lives. That's in addition to whatever the Coast Guard numbers are. I heard 20,000 or more saved by state and local responders or neighbors helping neighbors in Harvey. Over 4.5 million citizens have been registered in FEMA's IA assistance program in 2 months. It's an unprecedented number. It's never going to move as fast as people want, but let me put that into context. That's more than Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Wilma, Hurricane Rita combined. Over $3.5 billion have been distributed or expedited through the NFIP program, and that number is projected to climb to over 16 or 17 billion as a result of Harvey and Irma alone. Since the onset of Hurricane Harvey, mass care partners like the Red Cross and many state and local responders have housed over 1.1 million Americans in shelters. At its peak, there were 200,000 Americans in a shelter overnight. I have reason to believe that also the humanitarian mission to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in response to commodities is one of the largest humanitarian missions ever pulled off by the United States government, or at least within FEMA's context. We have a lot of work to do. I realize that. Turning the power on in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands solves a lot of our problems, and we're continuing to work with the governor. I spoke with, the governor was here yesterday. We're working with the governor, the Army Corps of Engineers, and trying to facilitate mutual aid to do that as quickly as possible. But we have to recognize that there are a lot of deferred maintenance issues in an antiquated system that we're having to overcome. We continue to build up the hospitals and medical functions to a truly stable situation. We have unique disaster housing issues for all over the country right now, from California to the Virgin Islands, and each mission is going to be unique. We have to continue to fix roads, clear roads, but also dispose of debris, and you can never do debris the same way any given time. We have a lot of challenges, but the long-term recovery of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands is going to require a far greater solution than what FEMA can offer. It may even increase the authorities that we have to do things in a more resilient fashion. Going forward to improve the whole community response, I would like to work with the Congress to do a lot of things. One, we got to streamline federal government disaster assistance. It comes down from a multitude of government agencies. We have to bring it together, simplify it, to make it down to the local level where it's understandable and easy to use. We have to implement and assure survivable communications. We can no longer have communications knocked out if we continue to go to digital solutions. How are we making them redundant? How are we making them resilient so that we don't lose connectivity and situational awareness? We have to increase pre-disaster mitigation funding. It does not make sense that you have to get hit to have access to mitigation funding. We need to put it up front. I'm willing to work with you to do that. We have to ensure that state and local governments have their own ability to do their life-saving commodity missions and not be fully dependent upon the Federal Emergency Management Agency to do so. We have to find low to no-cost ways to truly create a true culture of preparedness within our citizens. We have to help them understand why it's important to be insured, give them affordable insurance, but also help them understand that if you're insured, you're going to respond and recover a lot quicker than those that don't have it. We have to ensure that states have baseline capabilities to perform their own individual and public assistance programs when FEMA assistance is not coming. We have to fix the NFIP, bottom line. I don't like running a program that is too confusing to citizens, it's too cumbersome, and the bottom line is that it continues to go into debt every time we have a major problem, a major event. I'm here to work here with you guys in the spirit of improvement to do everything that we can to alleviate suffering and to build a more resilient nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Long. And that recognizes Admiral Schultz.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, committee members. It's my pleasure to be with you today to discuss the United States Coast Guard's role in the broader federal response to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. As the federal government's maritime first responder, we carry out our statutory requirements under Title 14 U.S. Code. And during disaster response missions, we focus on ensuring the survivability of our own forces and capabilities in order to conduct the post-disaster response operations, saving lives in distress, reconstituting the affected ports, waterways, and maritime infrastructure, responding to oil and chemical and hazardous material spills, and supporting other agencies. The Coast Guard stands ready to respond alongside civil first responders. At the same time, your Coast Guard seamlessly integrates with the Department of Defense in a variety of operating environments, as demonstrated during these recent responses. As a lead federal disaster response organization in the maritime domain and an armed service at all times, the Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to operate across the full response spectrum, often serving as a bridge between the military and civil response efforts. Coast Guard's been operating helicopters, boats, cutters, vehicles, and even on foot, rescued over 11,300 people as part of these broader response efforts. Working with partner agencies such as the Army Corps and NOAA, we conducted soundings, corrected 1,200 discrepant aids to navigation, removed obstructions in shipping channels to rapidly reconstitute our maritime transportation systems, key ports, and waterways. These are critical enablers to jumpstarting adversely impacted regional economies. We also work with the Army Corps and the EPA to coordinate the salvage and environmental remediation of 3,600 damaged or sunken vessels, and that work continues in progress. These storms arriving in rapid succession directly impacted our numerous Coast Guard facilities, our crews, our families. But despite that, your Coast Guardsmen always found a way to respond, oftentimes in the face of personal adversity, to help ensure the safety of their communities. After Irma and Maria, our multi-mission cutters and their crews evacuated citizens from the U.S. Virgin Islands, delivered humanitarian supplies to outlying areas, and facilitated port and waterway surveys essential to reconstituting those ports. Several of those same crew members then joined task forces to distribute essential commodities like bottled water and food to isolated communities. One out of every four Coast Guard rotary wing aircraft, helicopters, deployed in response to Harvey, collectively flying over 1,600 hours. That's more than double annual programmed hours for one of those classes of helicopters. Before Harvey's landfall in southwest Texas, two of our short-range Dolphin helicopters battled 60-knot winds to rescue 12 mariners on sinking vessels. While fully engaged in almost 2 months of high-tempo hurricane response and recovery operations, the Coast Guard judiciously absorbed risk in other mission areas and locations outside of the storm-impacted areas in order to meet our operational requirements to the nation. Forces normally allocated to counter-drug, port security, and fisheries enforcement missions were significantly impacted and reduced. As Maria damaged our Coast Guard facilities in Puerto Rico, including the Sector San Juan Operations Center and its command and control capabilities, the Coast Guard found itself challenged to coordinate operations. Fortunately, in anticipation of Maria's catastrophic damages, we had diverted one of our newest national security cutters, the Coast Guard Cutter James, returning from a multi-month drug patrol in the Eastern Pacific to Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, she became an afloat command and control, or C2 node, and was able to run the operations normally run from shoreside facilities. Emblematic of the Coast Guard's agility and our layered defense of capabilities, when James repositioned to Puerto Rico, a 48-year-old ship, the Coast Guard Cutter Alert, out of the Pacific Northwest, stood to watch against transnational criminal activities in the Eastern Pacific. That crew interdicted 4,800 kilograms of cocaine and arrested or detained 19 smugglers. In support of the hurricanes, the Coast Guard mobilized nearly 3,000 people. Roughly 2,000 of that was active duty, 800 reservists, and 150 of our civilians. Also a sizable number of our volunteer auxiliaries. Coast Guards from across the nation, as far away as Alaska and Hawaii, supported these efforts in Texas, Florida, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and the territories of the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's really one of the reasons I'm tremendously proud of this total workforce. Coast Guardsmen and their family are part of the communities impacted, and they were victims of the storm. Noting the homes of almost 100 Coast Guardsmen were damaged to the point they're uninhabitable, and we're seeking relocation for them. Our workforce is agile. We have decentralized command and control structure, and that enables us to respond agilely to these types of situations. Our broad authorities and experience working closely with other interagency response organizations allows us to take a lead role as the nation's maritime first responders. But these consequences, or these operations, do not come without consequence, without cost. These are measured in the resources operating well above their programmed or planned funded levels, delayed maintenance at the depot level, and damage to our Coast Guard facilities. We've identified hundreds of millions of dollars needed to restore the readiness of our infrastructure. These costs are compounded by over $70 million of unrepaired facility work from Matthew in the fall of 2016. When the Coast Guard has the opportunity to replace our facilities, we endeavor to make them storm resilient and survivable. In fact, several of our shore facilities that were built following Ike were on the paths of these hurricanes. one being a facility in Great Anagua in the Bahamas, which has since endured the passage of many facilities without damages. And in Houston, the center of gravity for the Harvey response, that was a new facility, also funded with post-IC dollars. And that facility was absolutely essential to the response operations there. Your United States Coast Guard, Mr. Chairman, are among the most dedicated, selfless, effective men and women you'll find in government. They rely on a foundation of good training, reliable equipment, blended with courage, discipline, and vigilance. They remain semper paratus, or always ready to assist. Thanks to the support of this committee, the administration, and Department of Homeland Security, we've begun replacing some of our aging assets, but we have outstanding needs. We have an unfunded priorities list before the Congress. Sir, I ask your continued support as we strive to provide the assets, equipment, and facility that our Coast Guardsmen need, deserve, as they answer the nation's call. And with that, sir, I stand by for your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Thank you for your service. And that recognizes General Jackson. Will proceed.
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Major General Ed Jackson, Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Corps conducts emergency response activities under two basic authorities, the Stafford Act and Public Law 8499. Under the Stafford Act, we support FEMA under the National Response Framework as the lead federal agency for Emergency Support Function 3, Public Works and Engineering. ESF 3 provides temporary emergency power, temporary roofing, debris management, infrastructure assessment, critical public facility restoration, and temporary housing. Under Public Law 8499, we prepare for disasters through planning, coordination, and training with local, state, and federal partners, assisting our partners to implement advanced measures that prevent or reduce storm event damages and repair damage to authorized federal projects, working with states and municipalities to rehabilitate and restore eligible non-federal flood infrastructure to pre-storm condition. When disasters occur, Corps teams and other resources are mobilized from across the command to assist local offices with their response to the event. As part of this mission, the Corps has more than 50 specially trained teams supported by emergency contracts that perform a wide range of public works and engineering-related support missions, as I just described. The Corps uses pre-awarded contracts that can be quickly activated for missions such as debris removal, temporary roofing, and generator installation. This year, the Corps has supported FEMA-led federal response and recovery operations in support of multiple events, including Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. FEMA directed 37 mission assignments to the Corps for supporting Hurricane Harvey response and recovery. Currently, the Corps has 183 employees still deployed. The Corps assisted in temporary emergency power and continues to support the state of Texas with the development and implementation of a temporary housing project management plan. Debris teams led by Corps subject matter experts continue providing state and local municipalities with debris technical assistance to define requirements and monitor debris removal and disposal operations in 15 counties. FEMA directed 81 mission assignments to the Corps for supporting Hurricanes Irma and Maria response and recovery. Currently, the Corps has over 1,500 personnel deployed. As of this morning, the Corps has completed over 1,000 generator assessments and over 500 temporary generator installations across the Caribbean. This includes 250 assessments and 150 generator installations in the U.S. Virgin Islands and 750 assessments and over 400 generator installations in Puerto Rico. Under FEMA authority, we're also assisting Puerto Rico with operation and maintenance of critical non-federal generators across the island. The Corps has completed over 14,000 temporary roofing installations in Florida and is on track to complete this mission by the 4th of November. We have also completed over 7,000 temporary roofing installations across the Caribbean, including over 2,500 in the U.S. Virgin Islands and over 4,500 in Puerto Rico. Roofing requirements in both the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have been extensive, requiring additional material and construction support, which initially slowed progress. We have adjusted, added capacity, and are seeing daily improvements in both locations. Corps debris subject matter experts provided technical assistance to counties across Florida and Georgia in response to Hurricane Irma and continue to provide oversight to 5 regions within the Florida Department of Emergency Management. The Corps is working to remove an estimated 1 million cubic yards of debris in the U.S. Virgin Islands and 6 million cubic yards of debris across Puerto Rico. The Corps worked closely with the Coast Guard and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and local authorities to open harbors and navigation channels across all affected areas critical to restoring commerce and allowing the flow of commodities and essential equipment to reach affected communities. The Corps worked closely with officials in Texas and Florida to manage local flood control reservoirs during periods of unprecedented rainfall. In Puerto Rico, Corps dam and levee teams inspected 17 priority dams and 14 levees, working closely with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority to stabilize a spillway failure at Guajataca Dam. Additionally, the Corps teams cleared existing outflow conduits and placed emergency pumps to further reduce water levels in the dam, yet restore flow to a critical treatment plant that supports the needs of over 30,000 people. On September 30th, the Corps was given a FEMA mission assignment under Stafford Act authority to assist the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority in conducting emergency repairs to the power grid itself. The Corps is partnering with PREPA in this effort and has established a general officer, senior executive level task force, as well as 3 area offices on the island to oversee work and provide technical assistance. The Department of Energy has embedded experts in our team and continues to assist in all of our efforts. Within 2 weeks of receiving the mission assignment, the Corps awarded contracts for large-scale temporary power generation to stabilize the grid in San Juan and for additional line repair assets that will assist ongoing efforts by PREPA to complete the mission as quickly as possible. The Corps remains fully committed and capable of executing its other civil works activities across the nation despite our heavy involvement in these ongoing response and recovery operations. We also remain ready and poised to assist in any future events as they may occur. This concludes my testimony, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, General, and again, thank you for your service. I want to yield to Mr. Fazo for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome Pete Lopez, our Regional Administrator for EPA Region 2. Pete is my constituent from Schoharie County. Also, years ago, worked for me when I was Minority Leader in the State Assembly, had a distinguished career of his own in the state legislature, and was also someone who suffered, his family suffered directly from being flooded back in Irene when it struck our area back in 2011. So he knows firsthand what he's talking about. So I want to welcome Pete and also excuse myself because before too long I have to go downtown for a meeting. So thanks for being here.
Thank the gentleman from New York. And with that, Mr. Lopez, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Fazo. Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, Committee members. I am Pete Lopez. I'm the Region 2 Administrator, which covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and 8 American tribes. And I'm going to speak to you directly about EPA's response to the devastating impacts of Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Much of my focus will be on Region 2, which is where I am serving on the ground. So just a couple notes. This is just a snapshot for members. You have full testimony. I'll try to keep it. I may not be following the script exactly. And also, I'll try to honor the 5-minute rule here, Chairman, so I'll keep moving as quickly as I can. So in response to these storms, EPA has assessed more than 5,000 drinking water systems, nearly 1,200 wastewater systems, including 100% of Texas and Florida systems. We've assessed nearly 250 national priorities list, EPA removal and oil sites. We've assessed more than 1,400 regulated facilities, recovered more than 1,500 containers, drums, and tanks, and worked with the Coast Guard to address oil and hazardous materials released from more than 1,800 sunken vessels. We were able to pre-deploy our emergency response teams and mobile assets to quickly conduct real-time analyses to assist with determining threats to human health. To minimize or prevent disruptions with the supply of diesel fuel for mobile non-road generators and pumps used for emergency purposes, EPA also waived the diesel requirements in these affected areas. EPA continued its round-the-clock response to these storms in close coordination with federal, state, territory, and local partners. EPA remains focused on environmental impacts and potential threats to human health, as well as the safety of those in affected areas. EPA has largely transitioned away from round-the-clock response to aftermath recovery, a significant difference between response and recovery for Hurricane Harvey. So here, EPA continues to coordinate recovery efforts with local, state, and federal officials, again, to address human health and environmental impacts, especially with water systems in the affected areas. As Mr. Fazo mentioned, and my privilege to serve with him and for him, in my years of experience as a state legislator, I was intensely involved in a response very similar to what's happened in Puerto Rico. So upstate New York was hit by Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. Here, my parents and my family members were left homeless, and 6 of my 7 counties were placed in states of emergency. The region faced very similar demographic constraints, very similar geographic constraints, mountainous territories, northern Appalachia, very limited incomes and very limited response capability. And through that experience, and this is personal for me because my family was affected not only in New York, but I also have family in Puerto Rico, in the Arecibo and Camuy area. Here I developed an understanding of how complicated it can be for areas to recover. And significantly for our people here, the more disadvantaged the community, the slower and more painful the recovery, and I cannot overemphasize that point. So as I turn to Irma Maria in the Caribbean, recently had a chance to travel with my colleague, Deputy Regional Administrator McCabe, who is here seated with me, behind me, and we were struck by the incredible devastation. And the sights, the sounds, the smells were all too familiar to me, living through Irene and Lee, very similar. Focus of the trip was not to simply observe, but as our mission, to engage. And the engagement was substantive. The engagement was working with local leaders, the Commonwealth, the territory, and our main mission was to find solutions to pressing problems. So very much main mission, but also troubleshooting. We saw incredible needs, and I can tell you the experience was very sobering, but also very galvanizing. So we are blessed to have an incredible team, and including my colleagues here at the dais, who are engaged not just substantively, but also understand the emotions at work and the challenges for all those on the island trying to resolve these issues. The overarching issue, and this has been highlighted by my colleagues, has been the lack of electricity. So if you can imagine dealing with these situations and having no power. So the lack of electricity has dramatically slowed down the pace and greatly complicated our collective response. In terms of our staffing, we have roughly 300 employees and contractors involved, with nearly 200 on the ground in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. You'll see in your written testimony, which all the members should have, more detailed analysis I'll try to highlight. In those bullets, you'll see reflections on wastewater treatment assessments, including plants, pump stations, trunk lines, wastewater treatment plants, a number of plants in service, those still out of service. You'll see reference to drinking water systems and our assessment of these systems, both utility-driven and systems that are not within utility, particularly on Puerto Rico. In the Virgin Islands, there's a focus on taking drinking water samples. There, the drinking water system setup is uniquely different from Puerto Rico. There's a heavy reliance on cisterns. And so our group has been supporting local officials as they conduct assessments of those systems and disinfection to make sure the supplies are adequate. We completed about 320 assessments of facilities covered by hazardous waste, risk management, and spill prevention, and assessed Superfund sites and oil sites. We're working with Army Corps and other partners to address debris. You've heard some reference to that. That's very complicated because the debris tends to be commingled. So if you can imagine all of the waste being put in debris piles haphazardly throughout these islands. So our goal is to separate the waste, make sense of it, and treat it accordingly. That includes possibly burning of some of the debris, although we're trying to maximize composting. In our challenges, just quickly, many roads are impassable, so we're still having trouble getting to people. There's a need for ongoing humanitarian aid. You heard that referenced here. Our teams have been trying to work comprehensively to provide additional support really outside of our role, providing water, thank you, Mr. Faso, food and supplies to remote areas where we're conducting assessments and where we may be the first teams on the ground. Also, we're struggling with delays to transport heavy equipment to Puerto Rico. So as we look to the future, Mr. Chairman, we continue to actively and thoughtfully respond to the devastation. One lesson that we learned is that every situation is different. No disaster is exactly the same. So we'll focus on the geography, the focus on the demographics is critically important. And for you as policymakers, I know you're wrestling with that, how we provide funding and support remains an open question. So in closing, Chairman, we're very proud of our engagement. We're very proud of our people. We are mission-driven, and we treat them as extension of family. They are our neighbors, and we are very concerned about their best interests. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez. Now we'll go to the questioning. Just remind members, we're going to adhere to the 5-minute rule because I anticipate there'll be lots and lots of questions today. So let's stick to the 5-minute rule. You'll hear the gavel if you go over. So let's be respectful of everybody here's time, our time, and of course these 4 gentlemen that have, as I've said at the opening, a lot of work to do. So thank you all, each and every one, for being here. First question I have is, Mr. Long, the Administrator Long, you had a whole list of ideas that I think everyone that I heard, there's great merit to it, and Mr. DeFazio and I were talking about it, so that's something we really want to explore in depth with you as we move forward. The dollars are precious around here, and I know that sometimes we don't spend money as wisely as we should, but I just saw there's a new study out that it used to be for every dollar you spend on mitigation, you save 3 to 4. There's a new study that came out that said it's 1 to 7. So mitigation dollars are important, and one of the things that you talked about, which I'd like you to expand on, is these the hazardous mitigation grant program only becomes available if you've been hit. And we're talking about pre-mitigation dollars. Can you talk about that and the importance of it and what we in Congress can do moving forward?
I would truly appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys to specifically change the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act is what guides my authorities to administer funding. Section 404 of the Stafford Act provides a formula that allows each one of your states after a disaster to access mitigation funding based on a percentage of dollars obligated from public assistance. To me, that's totally backwards. We need to shift that to the pre-storm side. And it does a couple things. It allows states to better plan for how they want to implement the key to their success for future disaster resiliency. If it's all put on the after the fact, if it's after the fact, you can't plan and strategize how you're going to access funding and ultimately to put your plans in place. It sounds very simple, but I know it takes a lot of work to do that, and I would love to be able to accomplish that with you and your support.
Again, you have a whole list of things that, again, Mr. DeFazio and I are up here shaking our heads saying we got to explore these things, so we look forward to working with you. Second question to Admiral Schultz. One of the little-known facts is we know you folks are out there doing great work. You're not only are you responding, but you're usually in the eye of the storm. And there's been significant damage done to your assets in the Coast Guard. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because again, I think that's something most Americans, most members of Congress may not even know is how hard hit the Coast Guard actually was.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. You know, we are nationally deployed all around the country, and in the areas that were hit by these storms, we've had significant damages to more than 40 facilities. I think if you roll up those damages in terms of costs to replace that infrastructure, in the hundreds of millions. We've had wear and tear on our resources. We flew our helicopters, as I mentioned in my opening statement, you know, almost 2 full years worth of operating hours in a 3-day period around Texas for support of Hurricane Harvey. So there's a roll-up cost that approaches or slightly exceeds $1 billion here as impact to the Coast Guard.
That was $1 billion?
$1 billion,
$1 billion.
roughly.
The number I got with your facilities was in excess of $500 million, but if you...
Yes, sir. Facilities, $500 million. I think when you're rolling personnel costs, other things, some ability to, I mentioned in my statement about reconstituting building facilities, resilient standards, modern standards.
Right.
That gets you to that number just slightly over $1 billion.
All right. Well, I thank you all, and again, well, thank you all for being here. I may have further questions, but I have about 1 minute and 40 seconds left. I want to yield to the vice-ranking member. I know she has to go down to the White House for a meeting, and I want to make sure she makes that meeting. Sounds like it's going to be a good meeting. So with that, I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Estes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being with us here today. And I can assure you we've already been talking about forming a working group to work on this issue of how do we need to change the Stafford Act. And I think it's tremendously important that we learn from this and plan for resiliency. So I want to thank you all for your prior commitment to help us do right by this. I want to thank the chairman and Mr. DeFazio for allowing me to go out of order here today. But we're not here today only talking about how to get it right the next time. We're also here talking about what we need to do right now today to help American citizens who live in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I have 75,000 residents in my district. That's 1 out of every 10 of my district in Connecticut hails originally from Puerto Rico. They and their families want answers. They can't even find some of their folks. We still have, 3/4 of the island without power, 800,000 without water. We have hospitals with black mold. I had a meeting in my district the beginning of this week, and family members inland want to stay. They don't have roofs on their houses. We're having real difficulty getting supplies around the island, so it's tremendously difficult. We know that, and we want to thank the FEMA workers and Coast Guard and everyone. You can imagine Coast Guard from Connecticut. We're very appreciative of your efforts, but we need to do better, and we need answers. And so we ask, again, for your continued work with us to do better, to work to allow debris to be cleared, to clear the roads, to get these supplies in as quickly as possible. But we're not there yet. We need to do better. We will be there with you and give you the resources you need, but we need to do better now. Texas and Florida got immediate relief in ways that Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands did not. They deserve it. All Americans deserve the aid of the federal government wherever they live in this great country. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I'm going to go out of order again. I know that Mr. Schmucker is going to the White House for that same meeting, so I'm going to yield him a minute because I know that he has a lot of concerns. Mr. Schmucker, will yield you a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate that. I'd like to first thank all of you for being here today. Thank you for your service and that all you've done in response to what's been very difficult, multiple emergencies, multiple hurricanes. So really appreciate that. I know you've saved lives, and so we want to thank you for that. I had the opportunity just about 2.5 weeks after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico to join a congressional group and visit the island. And my friend from New York, who's a member of the committee here, Mr. Maloney, was on that trip as well. And we had meetings with Governor Rosselló, General Buchanan, FEMA, Coast Guard, the Corps, a lot of folks. Not only did we survey the damage, but had meetings and received updates in regards to the progress that had been made at that point. And again, I think the takeaway from that was, this is an all-out effort from each of your agencies to respond. It's a 24/7 operation. We saw the number of people that were on the ground. So there's no concern about the commitment from each of your agencies, from the commitment of the administration to respond. And I'm specifically focused on Puerto Rico. My district is in Pennsylvania, but I also have a large number of people who hail from Puerto Rico, over 70,000 as well. So I've had a lot of concern from folks in my district about family and friends in Puerto Rico. The one concern, or there were, of course, many concerns, but one of the other takeaways from that, again, this was about 2.5 weeks, I think it was 17 days after the hurricane hit, and the response around restoring the electrical grid, I'll be honest, was unsatisfactory at that point. And there were many agencies, of course, that are involved with this. But we came, or at least I'm speaking for myself, came away from there concerned that we did not at that point yet have a really good plan to restore the grid. So I guess my first question is, and Administrator Long, I think you said it very, very well, restoring the electrical power will solve a lot of other problems. It's absolutely clear that's the critical path activity. At that point, it wasn't even clear which agency was taking the lead. So I guess that's my first question in this regard, and I'll start with—
Gentlemen, you can answer the question, but then we got to get back to regular order. So I appreciate the gentleman's question, but go ahead. And who are you directing it to? Anybody in particular?
Yeah, Administrator Long, sure. Tell us about which agency really is in charge of restoring the power.
Immediately after the storm, we had no choice but to basically mission assign the Army Corps of Engineers, who's been working around the clock on that. And that was actually done very quickly because of the diminished capacity. PREPA was nowhere to be found. And largely that's not a shot at PREPA. That's just they're also disaster victims, and the equipment was damaged as well. So the bottom line is that we moved forward and mission assigned the Corps to first do emergency power. So before you even start to talk about the power grid, you have to make sure that the generators at hospitals are working, they're fueled. You've got to clear the roads. You've got to do so many things. So there was emergency power, and then they folded over into basically the grid. So, and now General Jackson is here to, if you'd like to say a couple words on what the plan is.
Sure, I'd love to do that. First of all, thank you for the question. And I know this is on a lot of people's minds, so Mr. Chairman, if I can take a few minutes to explain it, that would be helpful.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. So the Corps of Engineers, I think one thing that's important to note is the Corps of Engineers typically does emergency temporary power through the use of our generators. That's part of our ESF-3 mission. That's what we've done in every storm so far. And typically we flow into the affected area under a FEMA mission assignment. We do assessments, we install generators, we deinstall generators as the grid comes up and operational. Typically, large-scale grid repairs are done differently. The affected public utility in the affected area activates mutual assistance agreements, and the multitude of public utilities from across the nation flow in to provide additional capacity to allow that grid to be more quickly restored. That was the case in Texas. That was the case in Florida. That was even the case in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That was not the case in Puerto Rico. So the Corps of Engineers does not have pre-scripted, pre-awarded contracts like we do for debris, for temporary power and things where we can quickly pull something off the shelf and award it and get things moving. We have to use our contingency contracts that we have, which are competitive contracts, to be able to bring in the resources that are required to do the work that we were mission assigned to do. So I think that's important to note. Mr. Chairman, can I keep going? Or
I'm sure you're going to get more questions on that.
Okay. Okay, I'll cover more at a later date.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
again, I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Pennsylvania can submit his other questions. We're back to regular order. With that, I recognize
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Fazio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Administrator Long, Chairman and I discussed, and I think you've got a lot of great ideas about how to streamline the programs and want to work with you on that. And I particularly support the pre-disaster mitigation. I won't put you on the spot by asking you a question, but I will observe that the President's proposed budget cut pre-disaster mitigation by 61%, not going in the right direction. Hopefully you can have some influence on that. Quick question. On Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, have you made any request for the movement of goods by sea that has not been fulfilled by Jones Act carriers?
To my knowledge, the Jones Act, anytime there's an issue that we would perceive that we would need a waiver from the Jones Act, we work very diligently with Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol.
But I mean, has there been anything you've wanted to move?
Not to my knowledge, and we would be very careful. We do not want to get in the Jones Act to get in the way of life safety.
Okay, thank you. Since we're on the issue of power, obviously the Whitefish Energy no-bid contract has received a lot of press. There is a provision in that contract and another one, which I just became aware of, with a company called Cobra for $200 million no-bid contract. And both contracts say that by executing this contract, PREPA hereby represents and warrants that FEMA has reviewed and approved of this contract. Did you or anyone at FEMA approve the Whitefish contract and or the Cobra contract?
No, we did not, and there's not a lawyer within FEMA that would have ever approved that contract, and the bottom line is it was not our contract. And the other thing to be clear here is we don't approve contracts. We review and we make sure that our applicants are following 2 CFR.
Right. So basically, as I understand both these contracts, there's a big question about whether you could find them eligible for reimbursement. The local entity spends the money, and then they apply to you for reimbursement. That's the way it works, correct? And
that
they have to
is,
follow your
so
guidelines.
there is an OIG inspector. I know that even the governor was concerned about it, so that he's also launched an investigation into it as well.
Well, there's and again, in the Cobra contract, there's a very peculiar provision, and again, I'm glad to hear your agency didn't approve it, because it says, in no event shall PREPA, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the FEMA administrator, you, the Comptroller General of the United States, or any of their authorized representatives have the right to audit or review the cost and profit elements of the labor rates specified herein. That's in this Cobra contract to some company in Oklahoma. I mean, what the hell is that about? I mean, we can't review it?
Again, we would never approve any language like that, and that language is added in after the fact.
I'm thrilled to hear that. Before I forget, I want to ask unanimous consent to put a statement by Sheila Jackson Lee, who wanted to testify today, in the record.
With objections to order.
Okay. And then I'd move on quickly to the Coast Guard. Again, Admiral, I believe the estimates I saw were like close to $1.3 billion in damages. Have you submitted a supplemental appropriation request? Because you're already way behind on, your ongoing capital needs. Have you submitted a request to OMB for that to be included in the next disaster appropriation?
Yes, sir, Congressman. There was a request for that from OMB to the departments here a couple of weeks back. We've submitted our request that's more than $1 billion to the Department of Homeland Security, sir, and it is making its way up, I believe, to the Office of Management and Budget.
Excellent. I'm really happy to hear that. And to General Jackson, then quickly, you didn't get to finish. I'd give you, if you got 1 minute, if you could talk about anything else that relates to the grid, because obviously that's a critical problem. We don't have drinking water because we don't have distributed electricity. And do you have anything to add in 1 minute to what you're saying?
Congressman, I'll go as fast as I can. I'm from Georgia, so that may be hard.
Take your time and answer it.
Okay.
Administrator's already talked about temporary emergency power generation. That is a key element of our overall strategy to provide power to the island. We've put in over 400. Just by comparison, we put in 307 for Katrina, which was the largest in the past history of the Corps for our temporary generator mission. So significant. We're also servicing non-FEMA generators under FEMA authority to provide additional capability for temporary power generation to critical facilities that are prioritized by the FEMA in the territory there on the ground. So that's ongoing. It has been ongoing since Irma hit, and will continue to go on until we finish the grid repair mission. The second thing that we were asked to do, we got a FEMA mission assignment to do the grid repair mission on the 30th of September. So about 10 days afterwards, when it was apparent that that was the best course of action. So the bottom line is, since 30 September, what we've done is we've awarded a competitive contract, brought in a 50 megawatt temporary power plant to hook into the Palo Seco plant in the greater San Juan was designed to help stabilize the grid and be able to leverage the 602 megawatts of the entire grid or entire system at Palo Seco to be able to help provide power to the citizens in San Juan, where the largest population density is. We've also awarded 2 additional contracts, one to Fluor, the Fluor Corporation, and one to Power Secure, which is a subsidiary of the Southern Company out of the Georgia-Alabama area. Those contracts were awarded the third week of October competitively. They had their advance party on the ground within a week, finding places to do life support, arranging for transportation, and they have already started flowing their crews in. 2 big ships are due in within the next week that are bringing in over 300 pieces of rolling stock that will allow these folks to get up into both the transmission and the distribution systems across the island to start the restoration work. Additionally, the Corps, within a week of receiving our mission assignment, initiated the purchase of over $150 million worth of critical materiel that's required, 60,000 poles of different kinds, 6,100 miles of transmission wire of all high voltage distribution to replace. And we've gone from site to site to site with the Department of Energy and PREPA to understand what stocks they have on the island, to refine our requirements, to get stuff in production, to go around to warehouses to find off-market materials so that material is not going to be a limiting factor. And we've done a multitude of that over the last couple of weeks, and that material is flowing into Puerto Rico right now. So within the next week or so, we have equipment, we have people, we have material all on the ground there to start making a much greater rate of progress on the power grid than has currently been done right now, which I know is frustrating to the governor.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And again, I knew that question was going to come up. It's probably going to come again and again, but I think it's really important that people understand, because there's been a lot of criticism about what's going on in Puerto Rico, but the mutual aid agreements weren't in place, and unlike the other states, which I think was pointed out by, I forget who pointed out, but that's something we need to encourage everybody to make sure that they have. So with that, just remind members, we're going with, when the gavel went down, after that, we go by seniority before that, but I know both sides operate in that way. So Mr. Farenthold is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster. On August 25th, Hurricane Harvey made first landfall in the 27th District of Texas, the district that I represent. Over the next week, it would slowly move up the coast, destroying homes, communities, and lives. Often TV news cameras go in search of the worst possible damage to make the most dramatic story on television. Well, in the case of Hurricane Harvey in the district I represent, you could have dropped a camera almost any place in towns like Rockport, Port Aransas, Aransas Pass, Ingleside, Refugio, Tivoli, Woodsboro, and others. And it would have been as dramatic as the worst footage they probably could have found in many disasters. Hurricane winds completely destroyed many of my friends' homes. Businesses were damaged or destroyed. And towns like Wharton had many neighborhoods left underwater for days following the unprecedented flooding left by this storm, the worst we've seen in decades. I've visited the areas ravaged by Harvey along with President Trump, Vice President Pence, and Governor Abbott, and I've seen firsthand the destruction caused by the hurricane, and I'm working hard to make sure folks are connected with the resources that they need to rebuild. You know, a town like Rockport, just got an email from the mayor today. They've removed 1.3 million cubic yards of debris, and they're 53% finished, and they say they'll be lucky to finish this year. And I've got to tell you, there's nothing more psychologically painful than walking out and seeing your belongings and parts of your house on the street. It's bad enough just seeing your trees there for months, but when it's your personal effects and your scrapbooks, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And I do want to thank the hardworking folks at FEMA, the SBA, the Army Corps, state officials, other government officials. Everybody's working hard and trying to do their best, and I want to thank you. We will rebuild. There are a couple of questions that I want to ask, and Administrator Long, I think you and I have actually talked about this before. Early on in the process, in the first months or so, people would go online and fill out their applications for FEMA, and about a week later, they'd get this letter right up at the top. It says, "You've been denied FEMA aid." And then they'd go through paragraph upon paragraph of legalese, and then at the bottom it'll say, "Oh, by the way, you forgot to dot this I and cross that T. If you'll reapply, we'll probably help you out." Why can't you get a letter that doesn't just add insult to injury to folks?
I would be happy to work with you on that. A lot of times people are denied individual assistance without bringing proper paperwork or levels of insurance. I'm very aware of that. I'd be happy to work with you on the language of that.
Thank you very much. And General Jackson, I want to talk a little bit about the Army Corps of Engineers. There are dozens, if not more, of authorized but unfunded projects in the area that has been declared disaster areas. For instance, up in the Houston area, there were improvements to reservoirs and levees that have gone for years not happening. Had those been funded in a timely manner, would the property damage and even possibly the loss of life been less?
Congressman, that's a really difficult question to answer. I can tell you that I think every bit of flood control infrastructure that we can put in place can be helpful. How much specific property damage it would have prevented in this particular disaster is hard to tell because of the unprecedented amount of rainfall that came down that far exceeded anything that I think the area has ever seen. But I think that any piece that we can work with the Congress and the administration to get the funding for, working with the local authorities to get it put in place, well, all of that together will help reduce the damages and hopefully reduce loss of life as well.
And all right, shortly after Hurricane Harvey, I began from hearing from companies located along some of the waterways, the Colorado River, and even some of the ports that were having trouble because they couldn't get the raw materials necessary because they were waiting for the Corps to get contracts or dredges in place. FEMA did a great job pre-positioning resources in Texas. So Puerto Rico, obviously more of a challenge. Has the Corps looked at pre-positioning or contracting for emergencies where you are writing in your contract where you have the ability to pull dredges off the other jobs or pre-position them in light of this happening? Because we saw gas prices go up 30 cents or more as a result of closed ports.
Congressman, that's a great question, and we monitor the dredge fleet very closely. Obviously, many of them are under contract to the federal government in various places, and we have the provisions to be able to quickly move them and repurpose them based upon an emergency situation, and we've done that time and time again. Many of the dredges are working private jobs, and my experience has been that when we ask, the dredge companies are more than willing to do everything they can to try to reconfigure and move to wherever it is that we need them to do in the interest of the nation. And so I'm happy with the response, but we have a limited number, and we have to manage it very carefully. But great cooperation from the industry to help us turn on a dime when we need to.
Thank you. I see my time has expired.
Thank the gentleman, and with that, recognize Ms. Norton.
First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for the workmanlike committee hearing you're holding. A couple of committees called off the committee when the Democrats asked for a witness. You've had everybody here before us, and you've had all the agencies here before us. This is what real oversight is about. I certainly appreciate the testimony of the witnesses, and I appreciate that you have been working under quite arduous circumstances. Actually, the gentleman from Texas presaged my concern, and that is for lack of a better word, perhaps Mr. Long, I should turn to you, I will call preparation for the inevitable. Puerto Rico is an island. The Virgin Islands is a series of islands. Annually, if not annually, often, I should say, they are the objects of frequent hurricanes, floods, and other natural disasters almost on a predictable basis, yet they are offshore. And unlike Texas, for example, which is far away perhaps from some supplies, or Florida, as we saw with the controversy about shipping, there is a big difference there. Yet it appears that the agencies were, if not unprepared, and it does look like they were unprepared on the ground, or may even have been surprised about these inevitable events, given the slow response, for example, that both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are complaining of. So what I really want to know, given the inevitable, why there isn't a virtual branch of FEMA, for example, on these islands. Why supplies aren't pre-positioned there so that this kind of a dispute, which is predictable about getting to the islands, does not come up. It's not as if this is the first time we have encountered this. I'd like to know what kind of preparations were made a year ago when there wasn't any hurricane. And what have you learned about pre-positioning for the next hurricane, which could be next year?
You know, ma'am, I can't speak for what happened a year ago. Again, I've been in office 132 days.
I'm talking about looking to what happened a year ago or the year before that to decide what you're going to do next year, for example.
Right. Well, first of all, we do have a Caribbean Area Division office. Okay, we do have people embedded.
Where is that located, sir?
It's in Puerto Rico, right outside of San Juan. And not only do we have staff there, we also have, you know, commodities pre-staged.
Could you tell me something about supplies, any of you?
Sure.
Since these are offshore, why did supplies have to, a dispute have to arise about whether there were enough supplies there? Why weren't there enough supplies to at least begin to take care of a catastrophe?
So before the storm hit, or well, let's back up. After, you know, we were there before Irma. We were there after Irma. We were rebuilding the power grid as Irma was passing. The second thing is that as Maria was coming in, we resupplied, you know, food and commodities on the island in Puerto Rico. We also verified that Governor Rosselló had food in all of the shelters that were there. And the problem with an island, you know, an island community is that you can only shove so much food, so many staff into an island, and then you start to basically take away critical shelter spots for the citizens. So we actually had—
You take away what, I'm sorry?
You take away shelter spots from the citizens. We've mobilized almost 20,000 federal government workers.
Mr. Long, I'm talking about basically supplies. I know you can't pre-ship power, but when it comes to supplies, you could have a warehouse.
We do.
You know, and what I'm trying to ask is, have we learned that perhaps we need to pre-position a great many more supplies, basic supplies there, basic food, basic commodities, so that we don't have to depend upon how many trucks will pick up supplies in a devastation like Puerto Rico, for example, is experiencing. Have we learned, can we rent or build a warehouse in those island communities so that we're not so dependent upon getting there in the first place?
Yes, ma'am, we have a warehouse. The question is it large enough? And we haven't been able to do an
exhaustive— Can you make it larger?
I'm
asking you.
If I may answer the question. Yes, go ahead. The question is, we have not been allowed to do an after-action review. All the things, not just commodities. We do have a warehouse. The question is, how do we expand that? But also, what is, you know, what is the role and responsibility of also the state and local governments to do commodities, not only from Puerto Rico, but across the state? If you look at the model way it's done, Texas has their own pre-event contracts. They store their own food. We backfill their ability to do the first 72 to 120 hours worth of commodities if we're ever needed to be able to call in. Every state, every island should have that capability.
Thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Mr. Barletta for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I turn to my questions, I want to thank Chairman Schuster for holding today's hearing. I thank the members and all the witnesses for being here as well. As chairman of the subcommittee on economic development, public buildings, and emergency management, we have held a series of hearings and roundtables on how we can rebuild smarter and better after a disaster. In every instance, we found mitigation is a critical part of saving lives and reducing costs. We must build in mitigation on the front end and ensure that as the communities rebuild from these recent disasters, we are building back in a way that will minimize damage in the next storm. So to these points, I want to turn to my questions. Administrator Long, FEMA has expert personnel who get called to deploy when disasters strike. How can we support the work of FEMA personnel and ensure continuity in staffing in the response to and recovery from disasters?
In a multitude of ways. Look, my staff works under austere conditions, away from their families. They deploy, they sacrifice a lot of their personal time to help others, and they work around the clock. And when it comes to pay capping, we could help there. The bottom line is I'd like to redesign the entire workforce structure and the way we hire. I would like to move to an FBI or Secret Service model where we hire in a true academy format. I'd like to increase the footprint of FEMA. I'd like to move us out of the regional offices and be embedded with state agencies and on island territories. I'd like to have multifaceted teams that can approve plans, do things on the ground rather than having to go back through a region or all the way to the headquarters. There's a multitude of things that we could do, and I'd be happy to provide it to you in writing.
That'd be great. I understand some states have robust state-level programs that can effectively leverage private investment in public infrastructure. The use of public-private partnerships, or P3s, could be another tool that states impacted by disasters could use to help speed up recovery. Administrator Long, do you think allowing states to use such programs following a disaster could be helpful in the recovery process?
Absolutely. I ran a private sector company for 6 years before coming back to FEMA, and I'm a true believer in public-private sector partnerships. We have to expand ways on how we utilize our Business Emergency Operations Center to get more private companies included. One of the things I'd also like to do is introduce a private sector toolkit to state and local governments so that they understand what types of pre-event contracts they should have in place and how to use them.
You know, we have been working to find ways to encourage mitigation in rebuilding after disaster. What can be done to ensure that people don't just build back the way things were? How can FEMA help ensure that the infrastructure is rebuilt or repaired better after a disaster?
So this is a concern. If you look at Puerto Rico, for example, with all the deferred maintenance issues, you know, like the average age of the power plants are like 44 years old versus the global average of 18. I'm already running into, when it comes to rebuilding, if we spend a lot of taxpayer dollars, which I would love to protect, if we're going to do it, we need to be able to do it right, but I'm not so sure that the Stafford Act gives me the authority to be able to do it in that manner. I also believe that disaster resiliency, the key to that success lies at the local elected official level when it comes to building codes and proper land use planning. It's got to be a greater partnership than what FEMA provides to state and local governments. It's a whole community effort when it comes to mitigation and how we focus on resiliency.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now recognize Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lopez, I have to start by saying that I'm greatly concerned about EPA's response to Hurricane Maria. It's eerily similar to EPA's response after 9/11 at the World Trade Center in my district in New York, when EPA infamously and incorrectly declared the air is safe to breathe and the water was safe to drink. Thousands of people became sick and hundreds died because of EPA's negligence and lying at that time. So I'm very concerned with that precedent. Now, I hope you can finally clear up some confusion related to news reports of people drinking water from wells on the Dorado Groundwater Contamination Superfund site. On Tuesday, an EPA spokesperson was quoted that water being pulled from the Dorado Superfund site is, quote, okay to consume based on the analysis that we've done, unquote, a quote that could have come directly 17 years ago. The day before, EPA responded to committee staff to the very same question about whether people were obtaining drinking water from the Dorado site, that people are not drinking water from the EPA Superfund site wells, unquote. That's troubling because it adds to the confusion, secrecy, and distrust of government sources in protecting public health and the environment. So I have some specific questions regarding the Dorado Superfund site and EPA actions to protect human health from known contaminants on that site. The Dorado Superfund site was listed to the National Priorities List just last year, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Thank you. This Superfund site consists of a groundwater plume of industrial chemicals and solvents, including TCE, PCE, chloroform, and other chemicals known to have adverse human health effects, both short-term and long-term, correct?
Correct, sir.
Thank you. It is my understanding that 2 wells on the Dorado Superfund site, the Navarez and Santa Rosa well sites, still have active wells in operation, some of which the press has reported were used as a source of drinking water following Hurricane Maria. Is that correct?
That's also correct.
Has EPA investigated whether any other well on the Dorado site was used as a source of drinking water since Hurricane Maria?
So, sir, those are the 2 that we understand are the ones that are used on an interim basis by PRASA, which is the utility.
So the answer is you haven't investigated whether other sites were used?
Our understanding is that no other sites are used, so those are the 2.
It's also my understanding that when the Dorado Superfund site was listed on the NPL, sampling at the Navarez and Santa Rosa sites both found traces of these industrial chemicals, including chloroform, DCE, TCE, and PCE. Is that correct?
It is correct. Just as a note, though, if I may, so
Talk a little louder, please.
If I may, the chloroform piece was a byproduct of chlorination, so that was an early indication that that is part of a public water supply.
But all of these chemicals were found there.
In terms of if I may, in terms of the chemical analysis, the analysis is roughly, was conducted on a regular basis by the Department of Health on Puerto Rico and by PRASA. We also have done sampling. Ultimately, in terms of the threshold of safety, those levels for the Santa Rosa and Navarro
Okay, but all of
are below safe tolerance levels for standard drinking water.
You're saying that all of these chemicals are found there, but they're below tolerance levels?
Correct, sir.
All right. Now, the Wednesday news report quotes an EPA spokesperson as saying that water being pulled from the Dorado Superfund site meets federal drinking water standards, unquote. Is that based on EPA testing since the landfall of Hurricane Maria?
Yes, sir. We have testing underway. We actually completed the testing for bacterial, microbial.
So but that statement that the water meets federal drinking water standards, that's based on the EPA testing since the landfall?
It is, and we have the results in-house.
Okay. Has EPA made all of the drinking water sampling data publicly available?
We are working towards that, sir, and be happy to provide a greater expanded.
But you haven't made it publicly available?
We have the VOC and the microbial. We have still working on the drinking water, and we'd be happy to.
And you will make all the sampling data.
Happy to do that, sir.
Immediately available.
As soon as we have the available data, we can give it right to you.
The press also reports that in 2016, when the Dorado Superfund site was initially listed on the Superfund National Priorities List, that EPA stated, quote, drinking water with the solvents which include tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene can have serious health impacts, including damage to the liver and increasing risk of cancer, close quote. Now EPA is saying that the water is safe to consume. Is that because they're below threshold levels, or why the change in position in just 1 year?
So there's no change in position, sir. There are thresholds that are part of the drinking water, safe drinking water standards, and in terms of testing, again, for the Navarro and the Santa Rosa sites, those are.
All right, so your testimony is that all of these poisonous chemicals are there, but that they're all below tolerable levels.
Sir, we are, again, our testimony is they are within drinking water tolerance levels.
Yeah, but you said that most of them, all the ones I mentioned were there, but they're within drinking water tolerance levels.
Correct, sir.
Is there any scientific dispute as to what drinking water tolerable levels are?
I would have to get back to you on the detail of any scientific dispute. In terms of the standards are nationally known and are regularly imposed, not just in Puerto Rico, but in all communities across the United States.
The reason I ask the question, and my time is expiring, so let me be very quickly here, is because this is exactly what we got from EPA after 9/11. All the toxins in the air were below tolerable levels. They were all okay, and everybody was going to be fine. And thousands of people are sick, and hundreds of people are dead because they weren't fine. And that's why I'm very skeptical. I thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, I recognize Mr. Webster for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for what you've done from Florida. And a lot of our counties have taken full advantage of Category A funding, Mr. Long, and I'd just like to say a little bit about that. And it's helped immensely. The 30-day window for some of us in some of our counties is a concern. I wrote about 3 weeks ago a bipartisan letter, actually, it was signed by me and others in the Florida delegation, talking about the fact that in my district, many of the homes were still underwater at that time because Florida's flat. And when the rivers crest, it runs everywhere. And so many of them could not even do an assessment a month after, which is just about the time the 30-day window was dissipating and there wasn't going to be an opportunity. And so we were hoping there could be some flexibility in that 30-day window because of the fact that not only was it impossible to do the debris cleanup, it was impossible to do an assessment of what that would take. And so, and I get a update from FEMA every day on flood alerts, and there's still one existing on St. Johns River, which is part of my district also, along with the Withlacoochee River. And so anyway, we got a lot of lakes. It takes them a while to drain into the rivers. When they do, that crest moves down the river. It floods everywhere, and it's usually past the 30 days. So I don't know if there's any way that could be modified. I know the state has a role in setting that, but could there be a dual track, or could there be an opportunity? And this is not the first time I brought it up, but I just think it's something that's still concerning. Just within the last week, along the Withlacoochee, did the floodwaters go low enough to where it's almost below flood stage? Okay. And so anyway, what can you say about that?
I'd be happy to look into that. In some cases, the 30-day window is dynamic where you can shift it to where it's more effective at the local government, but let me go back and verify that, and we can come back in. And not only that, we can also discuss with Governor Scott
right.
the length.
Because this is, it's not just a couple of days, it's sure. weeks, and the storm's gone, the wind's gone, the rain's gone, the surge is gone. It's just these floodwaters are still there, and it's still affecting thousands of my constituents.
I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Thanks a lot.
Yes,
Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being the ranking member on the Aviation Subcommittee, I really have questions regarding the role of aerial surveillance in sort of the immediate response, as well as an evaluation of disaster and what to do next. So for Mr. Long, can you walk through the process that FEMA and FAA use to consider any airspace waivers so you can better utilize unmanned aerial systems in the evaluation of damage, as well as providing direction to your folks?
Great question. Understand the concern, because the air traffic control system was totally wiped out, which made it even more, complex to sequence aircraft in, as well as the air traffic control above the islands. I would have to follow up with you specifically on that question, on how we can work closer together, or whatever decisions we can make.
Yeah, could you do that? Could you so you've provided a list in your testimony of a variety of directions you're going to take sort of in your after-action report. So I would ask you to include that set of questions and that set of issues in your AAR because of the clear role that drones are playing in not just commercial space, but also in disaster relief and response. We did hear quite a bit about how drones assisted emergency response in Texas and Florida. So were they used specifically in USVI and Puerto Rico as well?
I do not know, but I would like to work with the Congress. Particularly we we get a lot of complaints about the speed in which the inspection process takes place.
Yeah.
One of the innovative ways we can move forward on that is through aerial imagery and desktop assessments rather than having to find thousands and thousands of inspectors to go door to door. I am all for expediting processes through technology just like that.
Yeah, there was, I don't know how much detail you can get into with the use of drones, but you can get some detail. Insurance adjusters were in the office a few weeks back to talk about how they're now beginning to use unmanned aerial systems for claims purposes, and so there may be some routes to go. So for Admiral, can you expand a little bit on if Coast Guard used drones and drone technology for your assessments?
Yes, sir, Congressman. First off, the short answer is no. We did not use drone technology in any of the response operations. We're doing some partnership with Customs and Border Protection on drones for some of our maritime enforcement type duties. One caution I would say when we talk about response operations and drones in the airspace. So when we rolled in and were responding to Harvey, at one point we had more than 40 helicopters flying in the area with fixed wings flying C-2. First 2 days, first 36 hours, you know, the other agencies, National Guard, Department of Defense were falling in on our operations. When the Department of Defense started coming in heavily, you know, you start to have a very convoluted, clouded airspace. We had Coast Guard helicopters with aircraft stacked on top of that. There is an airspace deconfliction safety thing. I think there's a role for drones, an appropriate role for drones in certain times.
Yeah, and I agree that the space gets conflicted, gets crowded. My point is that the technology is advancing to a point where maybe you can relieve some of that fixed wing aircraft, maybe you can relieve some of that rotor aircraft and use different technology to achieve the same thing. And that's just, again, looking forward, it's probably worth looking at.
Absolutely, sir. I think we are embracing the technology. We're looking at, you know, bringing unmanned systems more on board the Coast Guard. We've done some work out at sea, and like I said, I think there's definitely technological advances, as the administrator said. I think we support that. I just caution as we move into that space, there's just some balance there to look at.
Well, the big issue we have is traffic management in this world on that. General, do you have any thought on that as well?
Sir, we have, in many cases after disasters, used unmanned surveillance to verify damages to long systems, long levee systems, or whatever that are hard to access. In Puerto Rico, we didn't have a need. We had access to be able to get out to the sites we needed to, so we didn't need to use them. But we do have them and have used them in the past.
Yeah, sure. All right. Mr. Lopez, you're off the hook. You're off the hook, Mr. Lopez. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and with that, recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Long, first of all, I want to say that I want to commend you for your testimony and your statement so far. Having been through a number of hurricanes and other disasters in previous life, you sound like someone who has been on the ground and actually dealt with these things, and I know that we did somewhat cross paths when you were working in Alabama, but I want to urge you as you deal with the bureaucracy, keep the perspective of focusing on people and outcomes, because we're continuing to see all sorts of challenges in recovery that I think are items that can be preventable with the right leadership. First, I know you're aware of this, but I want to remind you anyway, we did have a 1,000-year storm in Louisiana last year. It was an unnamed storm. We received more rainfall in about a 36-hour period than most Americans receive in an entire year, and we still have much devastation from that. And certainly our friends in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands need the much attention and the focus of FEMA at this point, but we still have a lot of lingering concerns in Louisiana as well. You talked about leaning forward on pre-disaster mitigation. Couldn't agree with you more. The fact that you come in and use HMGP after a disaster, statistically, that's not the place where we should be investing dollars, yet it's what we do. There's a particular concern, and I understand that Chairman McCall might have noted this. Right now, under Stafford Act, there's a provision called duplication of benefits. There are many projects that your friend, two people over, General Jackson, runs regarding the Corps of Engineers, where the Corps doesn't have sufficient funds to fully implement a project. Yet after a disaster, you have situations where FEMA comes in and gives hundreds of millions, or in some cases billions of dollars, to a community for hazard mitigation, reducing flood risk or other types of hazard risk in the future. Why in the world would FEMA prevent a state, a municipality from using those dollars to finish a Corps of Engineers project that's been through cost of benefit scrutiny, been through environmental scrutiny, and is viewed as having the greatest return of investment for federal dollars?
I can't speak on the individual issues that you're talking about specifically, but the issue nationwide is fragmented recovery when it comes from, have we ever taken a look across the federal government as to the number of funds that come down not only from FEMA, but HUD, economic injury loans, and how we actually streamline them and use them concurrently to do the greatest good? I'm all for that. Trust me, it's too confusing, and local governments and state governments have to basically hire consultants to be able to come in and help them navigate that funding. I'd be happy to meet with you specifically to overcome the issues with that policy. If we're standing in the way, I don't want to do that. I want to do what's right, and I want to do what makes sense.
This duplication of benefits issue and the way it's interpreted, it has some very serious flaws. I've had the opportunity to meet with the chairman, the ranking member on it, and had very productive discussions there, and the subcommittee chairman as well. There's a belief in the part of FEMA that you are going to duplicate Corps of Engineers money by using these FEMA dollars. Nobody's asking to build these projects twice. That's an idiotic response. And if we're all trying to be good stewards of federal dollars, this just doesn't make sense. Similarly, on the duplication of benefits issue, there's a position within FEMA now that if someone applies for an SBA loan, that is duplicative of, duplicative of a community development block grant, disaster recovery grant. I don't know how people view a loan being duplicative of a grant. Those are two totally different things. And so I just want to ask if we can work together to try and resolve some of these things, because these are not in the best interest of flood victims.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. It's way too complex. In some cases, where does FEMA's assistance begin and end versus some of the other agencies? We've got a lot of work to do to streamline. And I haven't had a chance to catch my breath to be able to put forward my vision of emergency management and the way we should cut forward, but I would be happy to work with you, because that is one of the initiatives of streamlining fragmented recovery across the federal government that I would love to be able to put forward.
Thank you. I think I could probably sit here for an hour and ask you questions. I'm going to try and get two other things in real quick. Under Stafford Act, the law says that when you're applying deductions for facilities, and the law specifically says facilities, that you are to deduct $500,000 per facility whenever providing PA assistance for schools and other flooded structures. Yet FEMA has come in and determined that a school should consist of a $500,000 deduction for a gymnasium, a storage facility, one classroom building, another classroom building, cafeterias, or whatever else. So in some cases, you could have millions of dollars in deductible coming from one school facility from a community that's entirely flooded, like in Livingston Parish, Louisiana. They don't have the ability to actually reopen their schools because of this structure versus facility interpretation from FEMA. And lastly, I just want to say that on HMGP and other things, perhaps coming in and looking at ideas like a block grant. We also need to work together on housing and trailer issues, but again, could probably sit here forever. I want to thank you for being here and urge you to keep the bold perspective.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. I might add, although today's focus is on the East Coast, natural disasters, I would like to acknowledge the unprecedented hardships faced by the Western communities this year with historic storms in the past winter and tragic fires that are still addressing today. The 2017 severe winter storms in California cost $1.2 billion in damage to our state and highway system that is eligible Federal Highway Administration's disaster relief program, but DOT is sitting on $911 million in disaster relief program funding they have not obligated to the states, plus sufficient funding to cover $4.1 billion outstanding federal disaster obligations owed to California through the years since 1983. DOT needs to obligate the money they already have for disaster relief and needs to increase the funding to the Federal Highway Administration in disaster supplemental. Wildfires in California have been devastating in October alone. 245,000 acres have been burned. 8,800 structures have been destroyed. In the peak of the wildfires, 11,000 firefighters battled 21 major fires that forced 100,000 people to evacuate. 43 lost their lives. And on October, the president approved a major disaster declaration. Over 300 homes were burned. A whole city was devastated. According to the California Office of Emergency Services, California has $2.5 billion in outstanding federal disaster assistance funding that has not been allocated. We need to pass emergency supplemental that addresses the disaster assistance and prevention for the whole country. In going back to this, Administrator Long and General Jackson, can you discuss FEMA and Army Corps' effort to address these happenings in California?
Sure. Yes, ma'am. I personally made a visit, met with Governor Scott in California regarding the wildfires, and I got to tell you, the urban wildfire that impacted mostly Santa Rosa and Napa and Sonoma counties is one of the most disturbing events I've ever seen in my career. There are actually, the last count, and I'm sure it's grown, 6,800 destroyed homes, and the fire was apparently moving at 200 feet per second. And I'm very aware, and we are there with Californians, helping them to respond and recover. When it comes to expediting funding, you know, here again, it's a partnership. In many cases, it takes 3 levels of government to make sure that the money can go down. I mean, I'm always in this balancing act, or FEMA is, of expediting funding down quickly to activate, you know, recovery, but then also staying within OIG expectations of making sure that we're utilizing taxpaying dollars. I do believe that Section 428, the pilot program within FEMA, you know, within the Stafford Act is the way to go. I do believe that we need to do more to expedite funding down, but ensure that project controls and grant monitoring and oversight training is provided at all 3 levels and upheld. It's got to be more than FEMA, making sure that the taxpaying dollars is being used correctly. And so we're with you and helping Californians recover.
The wildfires were in an area not expected, so we need to expect the unexpected.
Sure.
And I'm sure that we have need to expedite the use of agencies' ability to respond immediately due to increase the severity of the disasters. In other words, can we find a way to work together and not eliminate, but waiver some of the restrictions the agencies have on certain things? Because waiting in Puerto Rico is outstanding. It's just too long. And the people are still, some of them still don't have power. They still don't have housing. They still don't have potable water. Can there be a way to be able to get some of those things done, addressed immediately?
I would be happy to work with you on any waiver issues that you may have. I'd be happy to work with you to understand them better.
Okay. Is the energy going to be restored to modern standards instead of the 50 standards?
Ma'am, we're going to repair the system to get the power restored to the condition it was before the storm. That doesn't mean it's going to be repaired with 1950s parts. It's going to be repaired with modern parts. It's going to be repaired to current electrical code. But there's not going to be any overarching improvements to the system in terms of if a line is above ground, it's going to remain above ground. We're not going to put it below the ground.
Certainly. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit for the record some letters from the Governor of California.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Lady. And just General Jackson, I spoke to the General Simonet about the underground, above ground. He told me that some of the power lines, when they're dealing with hospitals and public safety security, will be underground. But to do the whole system underground is just cost prohibitive.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Many that there are underground lines there now, and so those, if they have sustained damage, will be repaired to the underground. But the vast majority of the transmission lines are above ground across the island.
Thank you very much. And with that, I recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent District 14 on the Texas coast, the first 3 coastal counties from Louisiana. We are ground zero for Harvey flooding. Harvey was a 3-rain event for us. It came in at Rockport and Corpus Christi. We got the bad side of the wind and the rain. Then it went up above us. It rained in all the watersheds north of us, and then it moved down and back on top of us and into Louisiana. About 80,000 homes were flooded out. My guess is probably 40,000 of those people are still out of their homes. Ran into Admiral Schultz as I crisscrossed the district. We were able to fly over with our great Coast Guard and see it firsthand. I have learned more about disaster relief that I hope I never, ever have to use again. So I appreciate y'all's work. I tell people that Harvey brought the downpour, but Texans and friends and neighbors brought the outpour. And so we appreciated all that response. Ike was the forgotten hurricane. Let me tell you about our district. My District 14 on the Texas Gulf Coast produces 60% of the nation's jet fuel, almost 20% of the nation's gasoline east of the Rockies. We are the 13th largest exporting district out of 435 members of Congress. We have 60% of the nation's strategic petroleum reserves. We have the largest Petro-Tex chemical refinery in the Western Hemisphere, second largest in the world. We produce a lot of gasoline and fuel, especially jet fuel. You saw fuel prices spike after Harvey. So Sabine Neches Waterway, which has the Port of Beaumont and Port of Port Arthur on it, Port of Beaumont sends out more military personnel and equipment than any other port in the United States. That's how important this is. Sabine Neches Waterway is shoaled in. It is extremely important. The Sabine Neches Waterway is the second largest waterway on the Gulf Coast, second only to the Mississippi River. This is a hugely important district. If you add a congressional district or two north of me, then we produce 80% of the nation's jet fuel, almost 40% of the nation's gasoline east of the Rockies. It is a huge energy district. We dodged a bullet with Ike. Ike almost hit the Houston Ship Channel and brought a 20-foot wall of water up into the ship channel. Had that happened, we would have devastated the Texas energy economy, produced fuel prices, although it already did because a lot of the refineries were shut down after Ike. And so this infrastructure, being on this committee, is extremely important. This infrastructure needs to be highlighted how important it is. You just cannot imagine how important it is for our state, for our nation, because it is national security. We need to fly jet planes and tanks and all kinds of things. Ike, I want to talk to Mr. Long with FEMA. There are some backlog FEMA claims still held up from Ike. Now, let's put this in perspective. Ike landed ashore on September the 13th, 2008. We would like to see FEMA come back and pay the counties for debris removal. There's a lot of claims out there that would help make whole some of these small communities. We need to absolutely have an ounce of prevention worth a pound, or in this case, millions of pounds of cure. So I would like for you, gentlemen, Mr. Long, and perhaps you, Major General Jackson, to give us a white paper of 3 things that we could do better in preparedness to make sure we've got better infrastructure, that you work well with Texas agencies, all of our agencies, really. As I said, Mr. Long, I've learned more about disaster recovery than I thought I ever wanted to know. And you're right, Texas does a fairly good job, but we rely on the federal government for backup. When Ike hit, we pretty much repaired our own state. A week after Ike, I call it the forgotten hurricane, because a week after Ike, the world recession came in, the bottom of the stock market fell out, the housing bubble burst, and Texas pretty much did most of its stuff on its own for Ike. So we cannot afford to do that. The governor of Texas now has submitted a request for about $61 billion just a few days ago to Congress. We can do things to make the coast better. We can do things, we're going to have another hurricane. We can do things to make sure we protect our energy supply, protect our ability to get the military in and out of the Sabine Neches Waterway. They were in the middle of an exercise, and they had to shut it down because of all the shoaling. Would you all be willing to give us this, the white paper, and I'll go with you too, Mr. Admiral Schultz, 3 things we could do better to prevent this in the future?
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Likewise, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back 7 seconds.
Thank the gentleman. With that, I recognize Mr. Sears from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this meeting. Thank you for the work that you do. I represent the 8th District in New Jersey, which is across from New York City, Hoboken, Jersey City, the whole area that was hit pretty hard by Sandy. And I hope that we can work together on streamlining this whole mitigation process. Because I've been working for the last 5 years on a project trying to get something from FEMA that was rejected. They don't tell them why. Then you appeal. They say you're still rejected. They don't tell them why. It's not a big project, but the response is just ridiculous. And it takes forever to get a response. So I hope that we can work together on that. But my question has to do with Puerto Rico, and I hope you can help me determine this. I know that New Jersey has sent state troopers to Puerto Rico, and I have some that I've spoken with. It's pretty lawless over there now. And I was wondering, do you have an input? Do you determine, or do you have a recommendation on how many National Guards are sent to a site like Puerto Rico? When you get there, do you say, well, we don't have enough National Guards? Do you call somebody?
We would be happy to get you the specific number that was there pre-Maria.
Well, it's 4,000 there now.
Yeah.
There are 4,000 there, but I don't know if it's enough. What I'm saying is, when you're there and you see how bad the situation is, do you pick up the phone and say to somebody, look, I think we need more help? Or you don't say anything, or you don't have the authority, or you don't talk to anybody?
Sure. So right now in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, we have roughly 20,000 federal, that's civilian and DOD officials on the island. Now, if you put that number into context, 20,000 people is like the average population of most American cities. We've deployed basically an entire city's worth of federal government workers to the island. Now, there are thousands of DOD officials there in conjunction with the National Guard, but I'd be happy to get you a specific number.
Okay, no, because one of the things that I was talking to the state trooper from New Jersey says pretty lawless, and I was just wondering if the people that you have down there, are they safe in some of these areas?
I would be happy to look into the lawlessness piece, but I have not heard that. Now, is there everyday crime that takes place as normal in Puerto Rico? Probably so, but I have not seen lawlessness. And quite honestly, one of the things that, because of the response effort, we kept security in check, after Maria went through. I'm not aware of, what you would determine as lawlessness.
Well, I mean, this state trooper would not lie to me. I mean, I know him pretty well, and there are a number of them there. But if you could get that information from me about the National Guard, because I think that's important, and I think you should, if you're there on site, and you can make a recommendation that maybe we don't have enough, I think that'd be great.
Absolutely, and I speak with Governor Rosselló on a regular basis, and not only that, but we have constant communication with all 78 mayors that are there. And in addition to that, we have over 100 intergovernmental representatives embedded with all the mayors in Puerto Rico on a day in and day out basis. So we use them as sensors to make sure that we're, trying to do everything that needs to be done.
Well, and as far as trying to streamline, you can count on my support on sensible streamlining, because it's just very frustrating dealing when you have a situation as bad as you have had in some of these areas, and you get very little response, and it takes forever. I mean, this is 5 years later that I'm dealing with this, and I know he was talking about 8 years ago, 8 years later. And one of my pet peeves, I'll finish, I don't know if you have anything to do with this, but I just hate these airlines. They're charging $900, $1,000 for people to come to the States. $90, $100 to go down there. You may not have anything to do with it. It may not be your responsibility, but I think we should look at this, because I have about 80,000 people from Puerto Rico in my district. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to alleviate the situation that the family has. And they're telling me that they're charging $900, $1,000 to come to the United States, when it's only $90 or $120 to go to the island. I think that's something that this committee should look at. I'm not saying that you get enough on your plate. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Mr. Mast from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. I'll be brief with my questions. As you, General Jackson, we've had conversations before. My district is a ground zero for storm water across the breadth of Florida. Whenever we have a hurricane coming through, there are several hurricanes. Water goes towards the Kissimmee River from the breadth of Florida. It flows down into Lake Okeechobee, and then it flows into my backyard. This is largely fresh water, and it goes into our saltwater estuary. So I want to ask a little bit about this in terms of emergency emergency response, this in the context of emergency response and what goes on there. Vice Admiral Schultz, you did speak about your role as responding to oil, chemical, and hazardous material spills. And in your purview, does stormwater ever fall into hazardous material, or in your purview, have you ever seen that be something that falls in there?
Sir, I'm not much expertise in the stormwater piece of that. Generally, it would be a vessel that would bring us out to a site. We work very closely with EPA, and in that type of situation, we'd come out generally to remediate, you know, oil on a vessel, other type of hazardous chemicals on a vessel. The actual stormwater, testing of stormwater, generally, I'm not familiar with that being our lane. I'm not sure if my EPA colleague has something to add to that or not.
Trying to look for clarity on hazardous material, really from any of you. I'd take it from any of you, clarity on hazardous materials.
Hazardous material in a wet maritime environment generally brings our attention out there, and we do get involved with that under ESF 10. And like I said, from a vessel standpoint, there's 3,600 plus vessels. Down in Katrina, there's different hazmat things that had floated into the city that drew our attention. So I think it depends on the specifics, sir, and we certainly work with your staff to understand if there's something particular you're looking at. We'll try to be responsible.
Quite often the case for us is the conversation of algal blooms, which often are transferred as a result of flood control. It's in the name of flood control because we do have an aging and failing dike there, but it leaves another area with a great deal of debris of very harmful algal blooms, often very harmful to human life, certainly harmful to sea life, and so that's the issue we face. I would hope that we could have a conversation perhaps as a group about this at a future date. Thank you. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses and the work that you are doing. I have three different questions. First to FEMA, Mr. Long. The disaster recovery program, the disaster response, you have adjusted the cost-sharing requirements for disaster aid for Texas and Florida as a result of the recent hurricanes. California has had a recent disaster. Do you intend to also adjust for California the cost-sharing requirements for the emergency aid?
So it depends. There's a couple things. The 90-10 cost share is triggered, and there's a formula that's set forth by PCEMA, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. And here again, I can submit specifically to you how that formula works. But basically, if I remember correctly, if the damage cost is $140 per person for the entire population of California, then PCEMA basically triggers the 90-10 cost share.
We'll work with you on that. The disaster recovery program. A couple of our colleagues have already raised this question about past presidential disasters and FEMA's IOUs to state and local government for the federal cost share in the recovery, and that's infrastructure repair and so forth. Do you intend to request in the upcoming emergency appropriation bill sufficient money to cover past presidential declarations and the local and state recovery money that is owed to them?
Right now, I don't have an understanding of the issues specifically that you're referring to.
It's been raised by three of my colleagues here, and this has to do with past emergencies declared by the president in which the local governments have put up their 25% and have paid for the recovery of various infrastructure, and FEMA has yet to pay the 75% federal share of that recovery work.
I'd be happy to look into it.
If you would, we think there's about $5 billion owed to the state of California for past presidential declarations. You heard from Texas just a moment ago, and similarly, most every state where there has been a presidential declaration. My understanding is what has happened is you've had little enough money to deal with the emergencies and the response to the emergencies, and therefore you have delayed payment on these IOUs. So if you would look into that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Coast Guard, you're at about $1.8 billion in infrastructure damage as a result of the hurricanes. Is that correct?
Congressman, as a result of the hurricanes, this season here, and maybe a little carryover, about $70 million from 2016. And Matthew, I'd say we're about $1.1 billion, $1.23 billion, somewhere in that range.
Okay. How do you expect to get that money?
Well, sir,
to
we are-
rebuild the infrastructure? This is infrastructure that is being used, that has been damaged, in some cases not even available for use?
Yes, sir, Congressman. There's more than 40 facilities that have been damaged here in the recent round of storms. We, at the request of OMB, through our parent department, Department of Homeland Security, have submitted our needs. That number is, again, a number north of $1 billion. It is working through the department. I'm not sure if it's left the
I
department.
believe
to
you've
OMB.
also submitted information to the subcommittee of this, the Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee of this committee,
Yes, sir.
and we'll work with you on trying to secure that funding. And it's out there. You've also had an extraordinary expense in the immediate emergency response. How much have you spent in the immediate emergency response for the 3 hurricanes?
Well, so like I said, in that number, that billion-plus number there, there's about $500 million that I believe is actual hard facility costs. There was some damages to our aircraft. There's you know, other wear and tear type things. There's personnel costs in there. That collectively gets you to that number that's north of $1 billion.
Ongoing operational cost of what I'm referring to.
Ongoing operational costs, sir?
Well, here's my point, is that my understanding from the information that we have received is that the Coast Guard has spent into its annual appropriations to deal with the emergencies, and you may have a shortfall for the remainder of the current fiscal year.
Yes,
And
sir. I
I'm
think
curious how you're going to backfill, or if you will be, if you need to backfill that amount of money. If so, then we need to know so that when the new emergency appropriation bill goes through, that we include in that bill the Coast Guard.
Yes, sir. I think if you look at, sir, where we were at the close of a fiscal year, and at the end of September, at the 1 October, we deferred things in our operating and maintenance costs. We deferred a $7 billion contract to replace 19 small operational boats. We had to make decisions as you close out the fiscal year, and there's, you know, a responsible way to do that. So there are some things. There's deferred maintenance, and that stuff plays forward. And we can work with you, sir, on those specifics.
We would appreciate specific information so that we can work on the appropriation, the emergency appropriation. Finally, I'm really curious how we're going to pay for all of this. I believe we just made a major move here in this House to significantly reduce the federal revenues. It's called tax cuts. I'll let it go at that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Dr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. My district is in East Texas as well. Dovetails right in with Congressman Weber, who we actually have the dubious honor of having the continental rainfall record in one single storm in my district, District 36. I also have more petrochemical refining facilities than any other district in the country. I have Port of Houston, a lot of damage, a lot of siltation and shoaling, and we certainly need to have some of these funds for disaster. But my biggest concern here, and I direct this to General Jackson, or really anybody who can answer this. A lot of tough questions had to be made during this storm, and will have to be made in the future by local river authorities and water jurisdictions with regards to lowering reservoir levels prior to the onset of a predictable flood event, so that we can save lives and property for those who are down below these dams. However, at locations that are under the authority and jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, because of their proximity and relationship to federally managed hydropower facilities, these local river authorities have told me that they believe they're basically powerless to make these critical decisions that have to do with lives and property. I've heard more about this issue from constituents over on the east side of my district in Texas than any other area. And I have here a resolution that was recently passed by the Cameron Parish, Louisiana Police Jury to demonstrate that these issues are often not limited to just one state. And I'd like to submit this for the record, Mr. Chairman. What are your thoughts on a solution to these issues? And could the Army Corps perhaps find a role as the arbiter between FERC and local authorities when these decisions need to be made, or possibly do you see a need for an interagency process to steer these decisions? For example, a process by which the Corps, local river authorities, and FERC all might have a voice in developing more flood storage capacity or lowering these lake levels when we have a known flood event about to occur.
Yeah, Congressman, I appreciate that question. Water management is always a very controversial issue, but I think FERC, we don't have any authority over FERC, but we work very closely with FERC on water management across the nation. I think there's always room for continued dialogue, especially as situations in a watershed change over time, to help us make better informed decisions on how we manage water, how we manage releases. There's significant advances in meteorology that have given us better forecasting capability that allow us to see events coming and better understand what's going to happen in the basin. I'd be happy, sir, to get with you and your staff and better understand some of the concerns, the information that you have. Engage with FERC, and with FERC, come and see you and have a discussion on what we can do.
Well, these poor folks that are with these river authorities have their hands tied. And they don't, the people that live below and lose their property and some lives, some of them are ready to take up arms. I mean, this is how angry these folks are, and blaming the river authorities when really it's a protocol, it's a guideline from the federal government. Who can make these decisions? We had a terrible flood on the Sabine River year before last, and we asked these questions we could not get answers to. So I want to have some answers. Do you know how we could amend these protocols?
Sir, let me get with you with your staff offline, and we'll figure out specifically which issues are most concerning. I understand the general issue that you're talking about. I want to be able to get with FERC offline, make sure they're aware of the concerns, and then maybe come in together and lay it all out for you so it's not confusing. We can think about what we need to do next.
Yes, indeed. I appreciate that. Anybody else have anything they want to add about that? Okay, well, with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, and with that, recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in September, the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico were devastated by a 150-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane that inflicted damage that was described as being catastrophic. A humanitarian disaster was unfolding with food and water being unavailable and communications being cut off. And there was a sense of desperation among the people of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And it was during that time period that the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, Carmen Yulín Cruz, became a public voice of the frustration being felt by the people of Puerto Rico. And Administrator Long, on or about October the 8th, you are reported to have stated, quote, "We filtered out the mayor a long time ago. We don't have time for political noise," end quote. Is that your statement?
Poor choice of words under a lot of stress. Yes, sir.
What did you mean when you said you had filtered out the mayor?
As I said, it was a poor choice of words. The bottom line is that we were under tremendous stress at the time.
I understand
and
that.
rapid-fire questions of the media and everything else.
I appreciate that stress that you all were working under, and I appreciate your efforts.
Right.
But what did you mean when you said you had filtered her out?
Bottom line is that anytime we're going through, unity of effort is what's required. And at the time, the mayor refused to be a part of the Joint Field Office organization that we had to ensure a unified effort. There are over 78 mayors in Puerto Rico that, do you mind if I answer the question?
Well, I do, but I have limited time, and that's why I'm interrupting you. Did you freeze the mayor out of those discussions with the other mayors?
No, Congressman, we did not. She had a choice to be
when you said that you had filtered her out.
That's not true. As I said, it was a poor choice of words, and specifically, we've had staff embedded with her basically since Maria exited. I have one of my best federal coordinating officers there right now as we speak, along with intergovernmental staff that's been embedded with her and all the other mayors, if they choose. Those are only 2 mayors that have chosen not to have my staff in there. Yeah.
And she was one of them?
No, she was not. We put forward, but all the other mayors have been regularly. All the other mayors have been regularly.
Cruz has been trying to cooperate with FEMA, but she's been critical of the response. And I would note that you know, 75% of the people in Puerto Rico to this day are still without power. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what about in the Virgin Islands? Same situation exists.
There are many without power in the Virgin Islands as well. Yes, sir.
And so when people complain about it, is it the Trump administration's muscular approach now to critics that you can vocalize your frustration? Do you feel that that is appropriate for a person in your position to make those kinds of assertions about publicly elected officials who are only trying to serve the public that they are elected to represent?
At the end of the day, I believe the mayor of San Juan and I share the same goal, and that is to help people. I didn't take this job to step on people by any means. I've spent 2 decades as an emergency manager, dedicating my career to taking care of a lot of people.
You have a
and doing
long
what
history as a professional in emergency management, and I deeply respect it.
Thank you.
Let me ask this question. In restoring the electrical grid, I know that some of my colleagues have asked a question about the suitability of going underground with power lines, and it's been stated that it's cost prohibitive and in certain cases the terrain does not lend itself to undergrounding. What I want to know is, are there any cost estimates that back up that assertion that it's cost prohibitive with respect to laying in underground utilities in Puerto Rico?
No, that's a great question. My authorities are limited in what we can do by the Stafford Act when it comes to making improvements, particularly when there are deferred maintenance issues on the power grid. It's a very antiquated system that was not working before the storm that we are having to fix underneath my emergency authorities. But when it comes to the permanent work of repairing that power facility, it's going to take an act from Congress that's far greater than my authority to be able to rebuild in a more resilient fashion so that we do not go through this collectively as a nation ever again.
Gentleman's time.
Thank you.
Now you're back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Administrator Long, did you have anything else you might want to add on the interactions with the mayor that my colleague asked about?
Negative, you know, well, I take that back. Look, uniformity of effort's definitely what's needed. My goal is to support the governors. I mean, I talked to Governor Rosselló, Governor Mapp. There was one day where I spoke to 7 governors from California to the Virgin Islands to ensure response and recovery priorities and making sure that we're meeting the mark. And we realized that there was not an emergency management infrastructure in place at the local level in Puerto Rico, and we proactively have embedded a lot of staff in each one of those offices to make sure that the mayors have a voice back to what needs to be done.
Thank you. Thank you. General Jackson, as you're fully aware, there's been a lot of discussion among members of this committee about the Corps' implementation of Section 408 permissions. From my end, you know, a lot of those concerns deal with 408 permissions on non-federal levies. First, can you tell me how many miles of levees will need to be repaired, modified, or rebuilt due to the recent hurricanes and storms?
Congressman, I don't have off the top of my head the miles of levee, but I know that they've been addressed in our submission for damage estimates to the administration. But I can pull that information and get that to you.
Is there a different process that the Corps uses for 408 permissions in the aftermath of a disaster to expedite them?
Congressman, if a levee is damaged and the Corps repairs it under a Public Law 8499, a 408 permission is not required.
Okay. Do you think there are many levees that will be repaired by the federal government that will not fall under that provision?
Perhaps there will be.
Will there be an expedited process to go through the 408s?
Well, what we've done is the 408 process itself has obviously been under a lot of criticism, and we've looked inwardly in the Army Corps to determine how can we improve the responsiveness of 408s, and we've waived and changed a lot of the provisions that we've had before, such as the percentage design requirements, not requiring 408s for more routine operation and maintenance type activities, trying to eliminate environmental reviews for 408s that are redundant with other types of environmental reviews, and we've worked very hard to power down the decision-making authority to the lowest level. So it's below the district commander now, all the way down to a responsible GS-15 like the Chief of Engineering and Construction at a district to allow for greater responsiveness.
So there's greater responsiveness at the district level. Are you noticing that when you implement these internal changes, are the districts uniform in implementation?
It's going to be really interesting. We like to call them geographically tailored solutions. And the reason I say that is there is going to be some difference between how one district, when you have 41 districts all doing something and we've given autonomy to them to do it as fast as they can, we're using the right engineering standards, there's going to be differences of opinion. There's difference in topography, difference in projects. They're not all the same. So there will be some differences, but I'm not going to anymore call them inconsistencies. I'm going to call them geographically tailored solutions.
That's a good paraphrase, I guess. We'll look forward to working with you, and obviously we will bring up the geographical whatever inclusion, however you called it, when we see some discrepancies. But I do appreciate you really looking at the 408 process, because obviously it needed to have some changes, and thank you for that. Administrator Long, it's great to see you again. You were in my office not too long ago. I appreciate that, long before the storms, and I think you've done yeoman's work in doing everything you can to address many of the issues that we've heard about today, especially from our colleagues who represent those areas that have been hit. I know we're talking about the hurricanes today, but you and I talked about a bill that I had, which is the Disaster Declaration Improvement Act, that would allow FEMA to utilize more localized impacts when determining whether or not an area that had been hit by a disaster would be eligible for federal disaster assistance. As we move ahead on this, this bill actually passed the House in May, 425 to nothing. We're not going to stop. And as you see these storms hit, you see many storms hit areas in the Midwest even. How can you tell me how those localized impacts can be taken into consideration by FEMA in the future to better assess true disasters and whether or not states and localities can cover their costs in absence of the federal government?
I think we have to do, here again, it goes back to the Stafford Act, it goes back to policies, but in many cases, small communities can have devastating storms but the overall statewide impact doesn't meet the numeric indicators that would say, federal assistance is down the road. I hear you loud and clear. I'd like to work with you, continue to work with you on how we can work through those issues.
Well, we will do that, and just like, it seems even smaller storms, not the ones we're talking about today, once a disaster happens, communities come together, agencies come together, clean up, and then we forget about the underlying policies that may have led to some heartaches during that storm process and recovery process. So we will work together when you get to catch your breath. Thank you all, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I read an article in Travel Weekly about the response of private U.S. airlines to the disaster. I'd ask unanimous consent that it be entered in the record. Hearing no objection.
Hearing no objections.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I'm going to have some questions. They're going to sound critical, but I want you to understand they actually are not, and I think that will become clear. First of all, I did have the opportunity to go to Puerto Rico 2.5 weeks after the storm with Congressman Smucker and a bunch of other members. We saw firsthand the extraordinary work and dedication of the men and women of FEMA, of the Coast Guard, Lord knows, the Army Corps of Engineers, and all the other responders. So thank you first and foremost. In particular, Admiral Schultz, a constituent of mine. I've got a bunch of constituents who had family there, very concerned. One gentleman in particular named Doug McCool from Hopewell Junction, New York, was very concerned about his parents who own a bed and breakfast on Vieques. Your folks actually located them and put them in touch specifically for him. It was great for his family. I want to thank you for that publicly. General Jackson, here's the deal. On this power grid issue, the bottom line is you guys don't normally do that, do you, after a storm?
That's correct. We don't normally do that.
And the reason you don't normally do that is because states normally have emergency mutual assistance compacts with other states. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And so private crews from other power companies show up within the days after a storm and flood the zone, if you will, and put those wires back up. Isn't that right?
That's correct, yes.
And those agreements contemplate reimbursement to those power companies by the power company in the jurisdiction affected. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Right. And so when the administrator says that you were, I believe his term was mission assigned that task, that's a polite way of saying that got landed on your plate, but you don't normally do it, right?
That's correct, sir.
And so when you say that by the third week of October, you had awarded contracts on that, unfortunately, that's a month after landfall, right?
Yes, sir.
And a month went by without power for the vast majority of the island's population while we're still sorting out who's going to do it. And then we award those contracts a few weeks later. We know all about the whitefish stuff. I don't want to get into that. But the fact of the matter is today your testimony, I believe, was that we now have Fluor and Power Secure and some other companies. I'm very familiar with Fluor. I understand these are very capable entities, and that we have about 300 pieces of rolling stock, I think you said, that are on the way to the island. Is that right?
Sir, we have today, if I may, we have 450 Corps of Engineers employees and contractors doing the temporary emergency power mission, which is what began after Irma's landfall and continues and will continue until the grid is restored. Today, we have over 150 contractors from Fluor and Power Secure that are on the ground.
Right.
Mostly...
You're talking about individuals.
I'm talking individuals.
But in terms of the rolling stock, I think you said 300 pieces are en route?
Sir, there are 2 vessels that are due in within the next week, one this weekend and one on the 7th of November. Each has about 300 pieces of rolling stock for those individual contractors. So when
Each has about 300 pieces of rolling stock?
That's correct, yes, sir.
So we're talking about 600 pieces of rolling stock. How many crews does that equate to? Do you know?
We we should have on the ground first part of next week 108 crews.
108.
And by the 25th of November, we'll have 181 crews. But we have gotten approval, and we're working through the action right now to increase
I understand
those
that,
numbers.
General, but my time's limited, so if I may, sir, I understand that. I had an opportunity to speak to the governor of Puerto Rico yesterday, Governor Rosselló. We were all together in Puerto Rico 2 weeks after the storm. At that time, Brigadier General Holland, who is your senior commander on the island, told us there were about 200 crews available, and they were going to double it through these private contracting to 400. You may recall I had opportunity to ask this question here in the auditorium a couple days later.
Yes, sir.
And your answer to me was that we were going to surge that to whatever the level was needed. But here, as we sit here, 6 weeks after landfall, the governor of Puerto Rico told me yesterday, sir, that the number of crews he has in the island right now is 400, and he needs 2,000. He needs minimum 2,000 crews, not individuals, crews, to get that power grid up. Now, I know it's not normally your job, and I know we got a couple hundred pieces of rolling stock that are going to get there at some point, and I know we got a few hundred individuals on the island. But for God's sakes, we are nowhere near the resource level we need, are we, to get that power grid back up, because the mutual assistance compacts that are normally in effect aren't working. Isn't that right?
They're not working, sir, because they weren't requested until this week.
In fact, Puerto Rico has an emergency mutual assistance compact, does it not?
Yes, sir, they do.
It's a signatory. It was said here earlier that they weren't in place, but that's not true, is it? They are in place.
No, they're in place, sir, but
It's
they
just
weren't.
that the power companies from other states aren't responding.
They were
Isn't
in
that right?
place. They're available, but the governor chose not to activate them until this week.
But isn't the issue that the power companies that would have had to respond were worried about being reimbursed? Isn't that really the issue, General?
That I can't answer.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But do you agree with me that right now we have maybe 20% of the resources, string and wire and running cable, that we need to get that power grid back up?
Sir, we have resources that are flowing in as fast as we can get it in. And
that wasn't my question. Respectfully, General, that was not my question. We have about 20% maybe of the resources we need to get the power grid back up?
Congressman, I don't know what the number of resources is in terms of the overall
You disagree with the governor that he needs 2,000?
We're still doing the assessments that we need to determine what the resources are. At the same time, we're flowing in as many resources as we can physically
You
get in.
disagree with the governor's assessment that he needs 2,000 and we've got 400?
I would like to see the governor's assessment on what's driving 2,000. I know we need to get crews in faster, and we're working to do that, but I don't know what the governor said. I don't know what he's judging 2,000 crews on, but we're working very diligently to get as many as we can under the authority that we have to be able to address the problems in Puerto Rico. And we're doing it
Appreciate
as
that,
fast
and I
as
want to
we can.
reiterate, I understand this is not normally your responsibility, and thank you for your efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, Governor Sanford, recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. I'd like to follow up on the interchange that I just heard, because whether it's 300 crews, 400 crews, 2,000 crews, whatever number of rolling stock, I think that the question is, how do you get more there faster? And so I guess my question would be to the administrator and the admiral. There was, as we all know, a 10-day repeal, if you will, of the Jones Act. in an effort to get more things to Puerto Rico quicker and cheaper. Would it help if that repeal was reinstated? I guess I'd ask that first of you, Mr. Administrator, and second to you, Mr. Admiral.
We constantly evaluate with Homeland Security and our partners at Customs and Border Patrol if there's any issues that we can't seem to get any U.S. flag vessels in to bring, whether it's commodities, fuels, or whatever else, to the island.
I'm just asking for a yes or no. Would it help or not?
At this point, I don't believe it would help to waive it.
You don't think it would? Admiral, what's your thought?
Congressman, I would echo the administrator's words. Currently, I believe there are sufficient vessels to deliver the commodities to Puerto Rico. So my answer is no, I don't believe there's a need for a Jones Act waiver.
So then neither of you care about the cost of doing so, because there are finite dollars in addressing the issue in Puerto Rico. And what the U.S. International Trade Commission has said is, in essence, the Jones Act represents about a 65% surcharge on cost of goods sold going into Puerto Rico. So what you'd say is, yes, we may have enough in the way of capacity, but it is at a much greater cost. And neither of you care about the cost?
Congressman, I would say on the Jones Act, sir, that is a law that's nearly 100 years on the books. There are many complexities in terms of national security. There are complexities with economic factors, the U.S. fleet, that I think would have to be approached very thoughtfully.
Okay, but that's not really answering the question. It is indisputable that it's at a higher cost, and you're saying that cost shouldn't be factored in getting finite resources into Puerto Rico?
Sir, I believe the cost when you're dealing with U.S. fleets, there's reasons for that cost. They tie back to the safety management systems and structures on that ship. So there's a cost, but with that cost, there comes factors that factor into the broader whole conversation. You can't, obviously doing things in Puerto Rico at the most efficient, costly thing is a consideration. The Jones Act it has a long-standing, almost 100-year history. So
I understand that, but it's also why the president repealed it for 10 days, because based on cost and availability, they said, we've got to get aid. But what we've seen is that this is a much longer rolling crisis in Puerto Rico than people would have presupposed. And consequently, wouldn't it make sense to, again, enact that repeal for a longer time period so that more aid at a lower cost could go into Puerto Rico? You say no.
I would say my understanding was the 10-day repeal was to make sure there's an availability of platform ships to meet the immediate commodities delivery need. Administrator, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that.
I would agree. I believe that question is beyond FEMA's authority to make that decision. I believe that decision lies with you.
Well, it doesn't lie with me. It lies with the president. But I think it's instructive because both of you all, as I understand it, requested that waiver of the president at the prior to the 10-day repeal. Am I mistaken in that belief?
Sir, I believe that waiver was triggered by the Secretary of Defense for purposes of national security for that short duration period.
Okay.
And then that process is through the Secretary of Homeland
Security. But you all did not object at that time? Sir, you thought it was a good idea?
Sir, at the time, it was a decision by the administration that we supported. Yes, sir.
You supported, and FEMA, if I'm not mistaken, you all support as well. So my simple question goes back again to the backlog that we were just listening to in the interchange. Given the fact that this crisis has lasted much longer than people would have presupposed, given that there is a higher cost to people in Puerto Rico in bringing aid and armament, if you want to think about it in defense terms, then why wouldn't it be a good idea to extend, in essence, that moratorium or repeal, whatever you want to call it? And both of you are saying, well, it's outside my pay grade. I'm just asking for your recommendation because you all are seeing firsthand the degree of hardship and plight that the people of Puerto Rico are seeing. And therefore, I would see that any thing that would help the situation down there, and particularly dollars are finite, and if you can get more throughput at a lower cost, that would ultimately be good for the people of Puerto Rico. I don't know why you all wouldn't support that idea and push for it.
Congressman, I would echo the administrator that I believe that is a choice of the Congress. The Jones Act has been in the books. It serves many different purposes. Cost response for Puerto Rico is a consideration that may be something that would factor into any discussions about whether Jones Act remained in effect and was eventually repealed.
If I might, just for one more second.
I got 15 seconds.
Yes, sir. That seems just such a push answer, respectfully. I get it, we can throw back to Congress, but what I'm asking, given that you all are on the front lines, is what is your opinion? And I want to make sure both of you think leaving it alone is best for the people of Puerto Rico.
Congressman, in full respect, sir, I am saying, obviously, as a responder, we care about helping those in need as you know, as best possible. I would say determinations such as the Jones Act have many layers of complexity and political considerations of that. Right. Ultimately, this expenditure of dollars is not in my lane outside of what I do with monies appropriate to the Coast Guard, and I guess politely I am pushing that back, sir. Yes, I think it's a consideration for the Congress.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. DeFazio and I are going to take another round of questions, but we'll go back and forth, Democrat, Republican. So I'm going to go to Mr. DeFazio first, then Mr. Perry, and then I'll finish up. So Mr. DeFazio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to provide you a copy of this. This is the last definitive study on whether or not there are additional costs and whether or not Puerto Rico would benefit from the loss of the Jones Act. And in fact, basically it says they wouldn't, because they wouldn't have regularly scheduled shipping. They'd be at the whim of the international lines, who aren't very interested in a little tiny market like Puerto Rico with regular service from Jacksonville. No. I'm sorry. After you read this, we can have a discussion. But the bottom line is, I asked, was any shipment delayed, or denied because of the Jones Act? And the definitive answer from the Coast Guard and FEMA was no. So let's not create a myth here to pursue an ideological agenda, which would both undermine national security, probably deprive the people of Puerto Rico of a good shipping service and other things. And I'm also going to put a copy of this in the record. So these are facts, and I know we have fake facts these days, but these are real facts. Let's move on from there. So I'm curious about this mutual aid thing. The governor is alleging that FEMA told him that because the Corps was designated to restore power, that he could not execute the mutual aid. Are you aware that anybody in your agency told him that?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Okay. So we have to get to the bottom of that, but that's his claim that that's why he didn't execute it. And the mutual aid obviously is less expensive than a couple of contracts, which I mentioned already, these no-bid contracts that Puerto Rico entered into. So we'll have to get to the bottom of that. And to one other quick question. Do you have, you gave us a litany of good ideas at the beginning that we'd like to pursue, but do you have also ideas about how we're going to deal with non-compliance of NFIP? Because we already heard that, well, we got a bunch of people here who didn't buy the insurance who were supposed to, and now we got to bail them out. You got any ideas on that?
We got to fix we have to make a decision. Do we want to continue to reward people building in vulnerable areas by giving them insurance that's not at an actuarial rate? Or do we hit the reset button and allow the private sector market to start dictating more of what those rates look like and taking over some of the market? It's going to be a tough question. But I can tell you that I'm not interested in running an NFIP program that's going to go into debt continuously. And if you guys did the good work of listening to our request when it came to providing the additional funding for Harvey and Maria, but if we do that, we have got to fix the framework of the NFIP to honor the taxpayer's dollar.
Okay. And one simple fix would be, we'll insure you once you have a loss. Next time you go to the private market.
We would be happy to provide you our thoughts on NFIP restructuring as well.
Great. General, just since I know your expertise is not necessarily the restoration of a power grid, and we talked about that extensively, but one thing I know the Corps is really good at is construction, temporary bridges. What are our barriers to, we're still hearing about problems with access to remote areas and highways that are, where the bridges are out or the highway itself is out. What are the barriers there for getting better access?
Sure. Well, first of all, the Department of Transportation has the lead for all the roads and bridges, and they're working very closely with the Highway Department and the Department of Transportation in Puerto Rico to do the assessments, to identify the requirements. They've already installed a number of temporary bridges. They've already put in a request for funding that the Federal Highway Administration has to bring dollars in to make more permanent, long-lasting repairs to some of the infrastructure. One of the real challenges in the remote areas, and I spent some time with General Buchanan a couple of weeks ago, was many of the remote areas suffer from landslides. So you may have a road that's cleared into a remote area on one day, it rains a lot, and you have a landslide that causes a road to close. You got to go back in there and open it back up again. So that's an on-again, off-again, long-term issue that we'll continue to deal with, especially gaining access in the remote areas. But I believe DOT has a pretty good handle with the Puerto Rico Department of Transportation on the way ahead for transportation infrastructure on the island.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Perry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Every single member of Congress, I think, all of the American people, their hearts are broken for the people of Puerto Rico and their continued suffering without power and without access to services and infrastructure. My questions will go to Administrator Long initially and Major General Jackson, who are Rock of the Marne. PREPA was created, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority was created in 1941 when the governor nationalized private electric companies on the island. And prior to the hurricane, the state-owned monopoly, which is PREPA, was $9 billion in debt with an estimated $4 billion in needed infrastructure upgrades at that time. A contributing factor to PREPA's dire financial situation is the fact that PREPA had been giving free power to all of 78 of Puerto Rico's municipalities, many of its government-owned enterprises, and even some of its for-profit businesses. The practice has occurred for decades, even as PREPA continued to take on debt, borrowing billions of dollars in the process. Property taxes which pay for it haven't been assessed since last assessed in 1958. Another contributing factor to PREPA's financial situation is its own mismanagement, according to a 2016 Synapse Energy Associates report compiled for Puerto Rico. Says this: the review indicates that PREPA's operational spending has not been consistent with operational and safe and reliable system since at least 2014. A major component of PREPA's operational spending lands in administrative and general functional area, and that spending in this area has increased in recent years for unexplained causes. And to give this figure context, in 2016, PREPA spent the equivalent of more than a third of its entire capital budget on discretionary A&G spending. And according to the report, PREPA's financial woes led to a deliberate decision by its leadership to forego the necessary infrastructure upgrades needed to to produce a reliable system. To keep its budgets under the cap, PREPA has engaged in what appear to be self-defeating practices such as deferring maintenance, extending outages to avoid overtime, and allocating budget away from critical but low utilization unit. The report conclusion is a damning indictment of the island's infrastructure and explains the difficulties encountered in re-electrifying the island. And it says the current reality is stark. Many of PREPA's existing units are in such a poor state of repair that PREPA must consider itself lucky if they remain operational for more than several months at a time, and that PREPA's transmission and distribution systems are falling apart quite literally. They are cracking, corroding, and collapsing. And it's my understanding that there were no activated mutual aid agreements, which we're familiar here, where when something happens, other power companies come to the aid. It seems to me that it's a dereliction of duty and an incredibly irresponsible in caring for the people of Puerto Rico, what has happened there. While restoring power to the island is necessary, the question is, should FEMA and the federal government be on the hook indefinitely after years of willful neglect of PREPA's grid? Mr. Long, are you set up for that?
I don't think we should be on the hook. We've been put in a terribly complex situation as a result of deferred maintenance and a system that was allowed to decay. And unfortunately, everybody wants the power back on. Nobody wants the power back on more than FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and we've been working through that, sir, left and right. But the thing is that a large portion of it never worked before Maria hit, and now we're having to basically.
And you're not set up to be there indefinitely, because some are kind of implying, they're making the implicit claim that you're supposed to be there indefinitely. Are you set up for that?
Indefinitely?
Yes.
No, we are not.
All right, and I just want to make that clear. We all want the power. Everybody wants the power on.
Right.
No more than you folks sitting in front of all of us. General, do you believe that PREPA should strongly consider privatization?
So I think there's a lot of decisions that face Puerto Rico right now, and privatization could be one of those. I know that the Department of Energy is really taking a hard look at the grid itself. They're looking at what can make the grid more effective, more efficient. You know, they have 15 power plants right now. They're supposed to put out about 5,200 megawatts, but they only use about 2,500 megawatts. The power plants have produced most of the generation on the southern side of the island, but all the people live on the north, which makes big high-voltage transmission lines vulnerable to the winds that hit Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of room for improvement. DOE's looking really hard at that, and they're going to be making some recommendations to not only what needs to be done to the grid itself, but they're probably prepared to make some recommendations on what the public utility could do to be more efficient and effective. I've read all the same reports that you have, so I'm not unfamiliar with some of those conditions that caused it to be the way it is right now. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. The Corps of Engineers is really focused on the response piece, and that is just getting this power grid back up as fast as we can and getting it to the most essential places where it needs to be. But we realize that what we're doing is in nowhere going to be the ultimate end-state solution for where the grid needs to be.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, thank you. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. I'll recognize Mr. Hunter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I didn't want to be the one transportation member that didn't talk today, so I figured I'd add on to the end here. So two specific things. There's it's called the Hermes. Are you familiar with this, Admiral? The Hermes, it's a, let's see, 30-inch outer hull rather than 34. The void on the vessel's bottom, 47 instead of 50. So they were turned away for bringing fuel to Puerto Rico because of the 3 inches in the double hull width and then the draft or void. That sounds kind of crazy to me, unless there's a really great reason for it.
Congressman, I think there's a vessel, the Moses Hermes, that has requested a waiver from the Coast Guard. I think, as you know, sir, as our subcommittee chair, better than anyone, you know, we're an armed force, we're a first responder, we're a regulatory agency, we're a law enforcement agency. Each of those has statutory reach back that tells us what we can and do, where we have discretion. The Hermes came forward. It's a subchapter I vessel, a general freight cargo type vessel. It's also an offshore supply vessel, a subchapter L vessel. It is not a subchapter D vessel. It's allowed to carry bulk quantities of flammable and combustible liquids. They are asking for a waiver to be able to do that by law, subject.
But you don't look at different things. If there's an emergency like this, it's months after, so it's different. But I mean, during an emergency, you would say a subchapter, whatever, can still do something, right?
Well, sir, I think there's many considerations there in granting a waiver. The short of this, as of Friday the 27th, the 7th District, who's supporting the officer in charge of marine inspection down in Puerto Rico because of their workload being in the center of gravity, they're supporting them. Basically, this waiver was denied. I think when you say, well, why is it denied, you're talking about whether it's a double bottle hull or not, the inches. It is not a double hull vessel by the law. There is an appeal process for this waiver, and I would encourage.
And one of the reasons I ask this is because getting into Jones Act and how much capacity there is for shipping.
Yes, sir.
So there's so much capacity now, we're turning down ships, is my point.
Sir, I would say I believe there's sufficient capacity of subchapter Delta ships, D ships, that do this, you know, move flammable cargoes like that. They're available.
So capacity's there?
My understanding is capacity's there, yes, sir.
Second specific question, there's a guy named Sean Carroll that does the prepositioning for Air Force One and Marine One for fuel. Okay, prepositions fuel, and you can imagine if you get that contract, you have to be ready at all times, anywhere, to be able to fuel up Air Force One, right? He's approached FEMA in the past, Coast Guard. He has that contract now, by the way. He prepositions fuel. He was trying, and FEMA has said great things, saying yes, we should do this when a big storm's coming. The Coast Guard's also said yes, we should do this when a big storm's coming. He's been in Puerto Rico now for about 44 days. FEMA called him and said, on like day 1 or 2, and said, this would be great if you could actually, yes, come on, you're in. So he's been on the ground with portable fuel, getting resupplied for over 40 days now. And I just want to bring that to your attention. This is one of those things where you have a person that can fill that gap, and they're doing it now, and they're actually on the ground in Puerto Rico. So I would just encourage you, I'm happy to give you the information on it. But I think that's pretty important. To pre-position stuff, I think we've already talked about it. But this guy's doing it. He's there. He does it for the president. It's a pretty good system of pre-positioning fuel. That's one of the things that you got to have, and it's hard to transport into the country, right, or to the province. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me add on to the end, and thank you all for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you for yielding back. I just have one final question, and I just have to say I've been in a position in my time in Congress that seems that I was subcommittee chairman during Katrina, and so I was very involved, and we tried to rewrite the law and streamline it. And then I was full committee chairman in 2013 with Sandy, and we were able to change some things, and one specifically. And so my point I was making is I've been involved in trying to streamline FEMA and emergency response for a number of years. But in the Sandy legislation, when we did the FEMA reauthorization, we were able to enter into, and you mentioned it, Administrator Long, the 428 authority, which is based on estimates, and it gives flexibility. I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I think those are the kinds of things we need to strengthen and move forward through all the agencies where we can do it.
Anything we can do to expedite funding but protect the taxpaying dollar is what we need to be able to work on. The 428 pilot program is something that I truly believe in, and we're working with Governor Rosselló to implement that in discussions now. For example, at one point, I read a report where there were 3,200 different roadway obstructions. Instead of writing 3,200 different project worksheets to fix these various portions in the road, we can write one project worksheet, estimate what it would cost to do that, but it makes it outcome-driven at the very beginning. So we can say, here is the design, this is what we're going for, you can cap the expenditures, and if we don't go that route, then each one of those project worksheets can be reversioned and reversioned and reversioned, and then we wind up being there for over a decade without completing the projects.
And it's been your experience, the states, this is something they welcome?
Some do, some don't, but I think that it's a constant balancing act, and I've invited the Office of Inspector General to FEMA. I want to understand how to make sure that we protect the taxpaying dollars and increase grant monitoring. But whereas the 428 says be more efficient and put money down, the Office of Inspector General reports are saying you need to batten down the hatches and do more oversight. So we're caught in this balancing act of which way to go. But I would rather get the money out and get recovery kick-started and done rather than wait years and years and years because of the reversioning that takes place on project worksheets.
Well, I agree with you, and this committee is going to be working diligently over the next several months to talk to all the 4 agencies here to try to figure out, give us the ideas, tell us what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and we're going to push for that. So again, I know that talking to Mr. DeFazio, and as I said earlier, your list of reforms is something that I think Mr. DeFazio and I will be pretty much on the same page. So again, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming here. I know you're very busy, and I got lots of work to do. So again, thanks for being here, taking the time. And with that, I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments. Information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And again, thank you very much for being here. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.